Okay, let's get proceedings underway. If you want to all grab a seat, and we can pick up the conversations shortly after our first break. So let me call things to order.
Good to see you. Well. We'll be all right.
All right, I think we're. Oh, that's a good one. Yeah. You're a righty bunch. Okay, everybody. Listen, thank you very much. You're all very welcome. There's plenty to talk about, as I can see, which is great, and it is great to see such a full attendance for the conference. I've managed to wrestle Sir David Stirling onto the stage already, so you can see things are about to begin. Delighted to have you here for the Northern Ireland Leadership and Governance Conference. I'm Jim Fitzpatrick. I'm just here to help Compere today, keep things moving along. It's great to be holding the conference in the context of restored government here in Northern Ireland, and I can tell that's probably what's putting the spring in your step and giving everyone a sense of the need to probably put some things into action. So we will have plenty to discuss today. We're going to run through till about 4:15 in the conference with a full schedule of some wonderful speakers, but very much a two-way street. It's not just about being talked at, it's about hearing what you have to say, and we'll be putting you to work throughout the day as well. So no sitting back. This is very much a sitting forward conference. It's also budget day, if you probably have noticed. And I suppose unusually, as somebody who previously would have covered this in some detail as a business and economics editor at the BBC, we know an awful lot of what is in the budget, but I suspect it was just the Chancellor doing you all a favour, knowing how busy you would be today, that he wanted to get it out in advance so you weren't addicted to following developments later on when he's on his feet. Although it does coincide, I think, with the lunch break, so you're allowed to have a look at your phones at that point. Now, finance, of course, is going to be a huge issue on the agenda today, particularly in the context of restored devolution, and as I suppose the public sector has to go through its transformation journey in this era of very tight and squeezed finances. So a lot to digest in that, and hopefully we'll get some good ideas on that here today. Housekeeping, just make sure your phones are on silent. The Wi-Fi was up earlier there. You might catch it on one of the slides. I think it's guest LH. There we are. You see the top left-hand corner. And the password is guest 2023. So if you want to log into the Wi-Fi, please do, but keep the phones on silent. There are no fire drills planned, so if you do hear the alarm, follow all the instructions. And just a couple of changes on the agenda today, but we'll work through those as they happen. So just to begin, we've got the three organisations who have made this event happen. Who are with us. Their leaders are here to tell us a little bit about today, set the agenda for us. So we're delighted to have them with us here. We have Sir David Stirling, the chair of the Chief Executives Forum, with David Burns, the chair of SoLACE NI, and Nicole Lappin, who is chair of the Public Sector Chairs Forum. So I'll not delay any further, and I shall hand over to Nicole to kick things off. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. I have the pleasure this morning of welcoming you to our annual Leadership and Governance Conference. And as you will have seen, the theme for this year is From Silo to Systems. What is the difference that makes the difference? Some people will say, and are saying, that we're already in a very bad place, and that what it will take to change things is a shock or even a complete collapse of services. But not everyone will agree with that sentiment, that we are in a really bad place yet. As people, we have faced previous challenges. Recently, we had the COVID pandemic. And this morning, I'm asking you to cast your mind back to remember, what did you do to work across boundaries? Who did you speak to? What decisions did you take? What things did you not do, and yet you still delivered? A colleague reminded me that it's not just a crisis that sees people step up to the plate. She watched as people came together to deliver in the run-up to the Good Friday Agreement. So my challenge to you this morning is not to wait until things collapse. Do what you have done before, and do it now. And part of that is getting closer to the communities that we serve. And what I'm speaking about here is true engagement, meaningful, constructive engagement. Our communities will show us the way. So just as I'm finishing this morning with these opening remarks, I do want to take a moment just to thank the people who have made this conference happen. Hopefully you will agree with me that the agenda that we are looking at is superb. It gives us opportunities for great discussions, to hear from system leaders right across the public sector. But if I asked you to take one thing away today, it would be the question, what difference do I make? So briefly, thank you to our sponsors, EY and CGI, our exhibitors, and also to the boardroom apprentices who will facilitate some of the cafe conversations later. As Public Sector Chairs Forum Chair, I have been delighted to see some of our boardroom apprentices being appointed onto public sector boards recently, and I think that's a testament to the work that Eileen Mullen and her team have done recently. And just as I finish, may I say thank you to the Chairs Forum Committee for all the support which they have given me as the outgoing chair. I'm really grateful, and I wish the incoming chair, Colin Coffey, all best wishes. You'll hear from Colin later today. So thank you and enjoy.
I think that was intentional, wasn't it? Okay, well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. For any of you who do not know who SoLACE NI is, we're the Society of Local Authority Chief Executives in Northern Ireland. It's not some spin-off of Daniel Craig and James Bond. We've been about for 50 years, and we are the collective voice of local government in Northern Ireland, ensuring consistency in our messages and ensuring leadership and wider personal development and support in everything in local government here in Northern Ireland. Just when I think back in my career and back to sort of 1999, it was a year of the millennium bug and preparing for everything that would come with the year 2000 and the impact that might have on our IT systems and the like. And I was a housing officer in Maryhill in Glasgow, which is one of the most deprived communities in the whole of Scotland, never mind even in Glasgow. And at that point in time, I was out consulting with tenants about new kitchens and bathrooms for their homes. And when I came out of that consultation session, my wiper blades had been stolen from my car, and that was just life in Glasgow at that time. And sometimes when you just reflect on language and like, if I had gone along that day to say that I was going to co-create a capital improvement programme with the communities in the area to provide an investment proposition for the internal modernisation of the fixtures and fittings, not only would my wiper blades be missing, my car would have had no wheels and it would have been bricks. And that would just have been life in Glasgow at that time. So for me, there's something just about language and keeping it simple. And NICVA, Celine has a session in the Cafe Conversations today called Joined Up Better Services, or Better Joined Up Services. let's keep it that simple. It doesn't need to be co-creation, co-production, co-design. You lose your communities, so why would we do that in this sort of room as well? So that's my first plea today. Let's keep the language simple. Recently, we've been out consulting in Lisburn, Castlereagh on our corporate plan. And as part of that consultation, I'd say to our staff, the first question I want to ask people is, what is it that really makes life worthwhile in your communities? And my corporate management team said, are you off your rocker? We're going to get issues about potholes, we're going to get issues about waiting lists, we're going to get issues about education, unable to get our kids into schools. And I said, well, that's exactly what we need to be hearing. If that's the issues that affect our communities, why would we shy away from it? There's no point in us as a council working in our wee silo and thinking we're great because 99.97% of our bins are collected every week. So what? So for me, it's about how do we do it in a way that we're joining up our services and thinking beyond our natural boundaries. How do we join up our services and make sure that we are there to support issues about mental health? How do we ensure that those kids that didn't necessarily get the education they require can end up in a positive destination when they leave school? It's far more than just what we as a council would do on a daily basis. And I know, in working in partnership with you guys, these are the sort of things that we need to address. Those are the big ticket items that mean people to in our area, mean to people in our area. So let's see how we can do that today and take enthusiasm from this room and really drive things over the coming year. My third and final plea is I've obviously mentioned co-production, co-creation and co-design. There's a good chance we have our two most senior politicians here today, and probably civil servants have written their statement. So if they use that language, my plea is please don't be looking and pointing at me and laughing because I've said not to use that language. They have the advantage of having a big burly security guard looking after their car outside, so there's no chance of it ending up in bricks. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, please have a great day, and I look forward to the engagement throughout. Thank you.
Trying to watch out for the squeaky bit. I'm David Sterling. I'm chair of the Chief Executives Forum. Great pleasure to be here again. I remember the energy that was in the room last year, and I found it a very uplifting event. I'll start by just echoing Nicole's comments. Big thanks to our sponsors, EY and to CGI, to all the exhibitors. Please take a little bit of time to look at their wares. And also to the boardroom apprentices. And without all those people, really, this wouldn't happen. I don't want to be Dr. Doom. We've got Neil Gibson later to fill that role. and will do it even better than I ever could, and I'm pretty good at it. There are plenty of reasons to be apprehensive, to be concerned, because we do face a major crisis in our public services. The one difference this year compared with last year is that we will have two First Ministers with us, and I think we've probably all been quite pleased to see the way in which they have responded to their new roles. They're out and about and they're listening to people. So you will all have an opportunity today to speak to the First Ministers, hopefully, and to hear what they have to say. But whatever the ministers, whatever the executive decides, change will only happen through us, through the people in this room. And things will only happen well if we work together in pursuit of common goals. We did that exceedingly well 4 years ago during COVID, and somehow or other we need to capture that spirit again. So today we will hear from a variety of speakers. You will hear great ideas, but I think the strength of today is the fact that we're all here together. I would encourage you all to stay through the day, to take part in the discussions after lunch. I think all of us could usefully set a target of walking away today thinking, here's one thing I could do differently. And also finding somebody who is in another organisation but who's working in the same area as you, and see if there is something you could agree that together you might be able to do differently. If all of us manage to do something like that, then I think we will make a difference. But most of all, enjoy the day and hopefully you will get energy from just being with everybody else. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David. I can avoid the squeaky bit by coming up this way, just to note for anybody else who's looking for tips for later on. Listen, thank you very much for setting the agenda there for us. There's plenty to get into today. So could I just say again a big special thanks and let them return to their seats to Nicole, to David, and to the other David. Thank you all very much indeed. So we will be continuing in a moment with our first key speaker who's going to get us thinking. And just a reminder, as you've heard there is a big exhibition area out there. So when you do get a chance, do wander around and see what we have got here for you to dig into. There are going to be a couple of changes in the programme today, as there always are, but he's already been mentioned. Dr. Doom, that's a new one for you, Neil. It is budget day, so we're very lucky to have the Permanent Secretary at the Department of Finance with us to sort of dig into the finances, and we'll be hearing from Neil shortly at about 10:15. He may even have some time to take some questions. So we look forward to that. And then after that, as I think, again, we've already heard hinted at, we will hear from the new leaders at the Executive Office, Michelle O'Neill and Emma Little-Pengelly, before we get into the big conversation, which is where we're going to be asking you to play your part. But first, someone who can really get us thinking. He has worked at the sharp end of business and technology for 4 decades almost, and has developed a deep understanding of how the world is changing and how we need to respond. This is going to be a chance to really sort of get us thinking at the beginning of the day. He's a successful author, and he's the founder of the Intelligent Leadership Hub. So, to help us embrace the unknowable, ladies and gentlemen, Aid McCormack.
Delighted to be here. Thank you, Jim. Imagine you're the captain of a football team and you spend the bulk of your time chasing the ball around the pitch, issuing instructions to your players. After a while, you become tired and you can't keep up with the ball, and your players don't get the instructions that they need to progress the game. That's a ridiculous way to run a football team. But that's how many organisations are run today, and it's causing society to fray. So what we're going to do is look at what's causing the world to become increasingly unknowable. We're going to get an understanding of why most organisations today are not fit for this increasing disruption. And then we're going to explore a way forward in terms of how we can embrace this unknowable future. So, looking at disruption. Football is a finite game. Very clear rules, very clear boundaries, very clear scoring mechanism. And that's the kind of model in which our organisations have operated, in the last 300 years, in fact. But we're entering the so-called infinite game now. There are no rules, there are no boundaries, there's an indeterminate number of balls at any given time. You might say the only objective of the infinite game is to stay in the game. So it's all about survival. So what's caused us to have to move from this finite to infinite game? Well, for the last 300 years, we've had a kind of synthetic certainty, give or take a few world wars and the Troubles, of course. But the powers that be have tried to create a predictability in society because that's the only way the factory model would work. The factory model, the people that were going to invest in the factories needed to know that the demand for the goods produced by the factories would be of sufficient duration to justify that investment. So the powers that be set about creating, if you like, predictability, synthetic certainty in society. And that kind of worked more or less for 300 years, but it no longer works. To really understand how this disruption has started, we need to go back a few years. So, 240,000 generations ago, our ancestor came down from the trees and waved goodbye to his chimpanzee family. Fast forward to 72,000 generations ago, when our ancestor first picked up a rock for the purposes of doing something or someone. That was a major day for mankind, because on that day we decided to augment ourselves. On that day we decided to take control of our own destiny, and on that day the technology industry was created. Since then, we've seen exponential growth in terms of new technology. We've seen the wheel, the printing press, that ill-fitting exoskeleton that many refer to as a car. More recently, we've seen the desktop computer and the smartphone. Such is the nature of exponential technology growth that today is a cause for celebration, because today is literally the fastest day we have ever experienced in terms of technology growth. But by the same token, it's the slowest day we will ever experience again. So the uncertainty and volatility that we're seeing in the marketplace today is simply a warm-up act for what is to come. Some of you will be familiar with PEST or PESTLE analysis. This is a technique for studying the macro-environmental forces bearing down on our organization. I prefer to think of it in terms of pestilence. Increasing disruption gives rise to novel situations which demand an innovative response. So that's pushing the bar up in terms of our innovation obligations, if you like. There is a war for natural resources. There is a war for cognition, also known as talent. And we'll see fairly soon that the definition of talent is starting to change. And in terms of extraterrestrial, I'm not talking about so much alien invasions, but the geopolitics of the solar system and beyond, and the technologies that emerge from those space races, and how they find their way back into our society, and the implications for our society in that respect. For those of us that were hoping that perhaps, we've had a few bouncy years and we're going to come back into some sort of steady state, the reality is that disruption is only just taking off its tracksuit. So what we're going to do now is look at why most organizations today, public sector and private sector, are ill-suited for increasing disruption. We're going to look at this through a number of different lenses: the motive for the organization, the leadership model, the use of technology, how people are treated, and so on. Looking at the operating model, essentially, we all run factories. We're process-driven. This is often referred to as Taylorism or scientific management. We deify efficiency. We worship efficiency. And what's wrong with efficiency? Efficiency drives out costs. It allows private sector companies to make a profit. It allows us to deliver more for less. Nature values efficiency. Out on the savannah, we didn't know when we were going to eat next, so we managed our energy very, very carefully. But nature values survival more so than efficiency. And so efficiency is not enough. You're not going to be able to cost manage your way through the future, so to speak. In this, if you like, Taylorist model, process comes first, people come second. People and technology are merely cogs in the machine. But people have a natural tendency to be curious, creative, even courageous. If that was to happen in most organizations today, that individual would end up having a stern conversation with HR and be told to get back to following the operations manual, because what they're essentially doing is inefficient. That's a problem, and it's also causing us to suppress our humanity, which is not good for us individually, and it's not good for society. There's a lot of talk about digital transformation, and what's not to like about faster, smarter, cheaper. But a faster, smarter, cheaper Titanic is still a Titanic. And even one optimized to detect icebergs is no match for air travel. My point here is that sprinkling your old school business model with technology pixie dust is not going to make it fit for an unknowable future. despite what the World Economic Forum tells us. The changes that we're going to need to make are going to be much more profound than that. Looking now at people, we've already seen the automation of blue-collar work. We're now seeing the blue-collarization of white-collar work. None of us are safe. None of us really know what we'll be doing in 2 or 3 years' time. You might say the new definition of talent is being able to do something that an algorithm or a robot or an AI tool cannot do that is of value. This typically means bringing our cognition to bear, our ability to be creative, to pattern match, to think in terms of constructs, and to pick up on weak signals in very small data sets. Now, the banks, for example, they're in a race to the bottom. They're looking to automate everything, get everyone out of the building, so to speak. They will eventually be 100% efficient. However, they'll be operating on approximately 0% margin because eventually all the other banks will be doing the same. From a leadership perspective, leadership today typically is very, very centralized. A handful of people in a well-appointed room making all the big decisions for everyone else. That's a kind of waste of cognition in many respects. All the workforce, their brains are not being put to use. They're simply following processes. All the decisions are made by a very small handful of people. That leads to sclerotic decision-making, missed opportunities, fumbled management of threats. And in this model, essentially, HR is merely a department in the procurement function. Now, in the private sector, there's a big push towards profits. In the public sector, a big push towards efficiency. Both of these behaviors lead to very short-term thinking, which is not good for society, and it's not good for talent, and it's not good for the planet either. If we look at this from a societal perspective, we've had the internet. It enabled us to communicate with each other. The Internet of Things have allowed devices to communicate with each other. As portables become wearables, as wearables become embeddables, the Internet of Things becomes the Internet of Things in people. We are becoming augmented. That journey started, that convergence journey with technology started when we first picked up that rock. Some might say we're speciating from Homo sapiens to Homo extensis, or augmented man. Now, whether you believe that to be the case or not, the reality is we're becoming more augmented. And augmented citizens require augmented services. So that has profound implications for us. One of the perhaps more dystopian aspects of society is that we're spending more and more of our time staring at glass. And the more time we spend staring at glass, the more susceptible we are to being programmed by basically kind of emotional architects, organizations that perhaps don't necessarily have our best interests at heart. You might say the metaverse is the final chapter in the Matrix, where we are immersed 24/7 in a programmable state. So we're going off in a very dark direction in many respects. So what we have is our motive is efficiency today. Our leadership model is highly centralized. Operating model is that of a factory. You might say, well, we're not a factory because we don't have any conveyor belts and we don't wear hard hats. But basically, you do have a conveyor belt. That's your network. And the unfinished goods moving along it is data. Technology is used for automation. There's nothing wrong with automation, but automation is not enough. People, we treat them like cogs. That's dehumanizing. It's not good for our wellness in any respect. This is taking us down a dystopian path, and it's not sustainable. So, how do we play the infinite game? Well, the most successful human operating model, optimized for the harshest conditions over many hundreds of thousands of years, is that of the tribe. We were all tribal up until around 12,000 years ago. Human adaptations take around 25,000 years. We're still wired to be tribal. Tribes only do really three things. They sense. The faint snap of a twig or the growl of an animal could spell death for the tribe. So tribes are very sensitive to their environment. They lived in the moment. It was all about survival. They would then use that data to decide what they're going to do, and then they would act. 3 things: sense, decide, act. They didn't have multi-year strategic plans. They certainly had goals, they certainly had missions, but they were very, very much in contact with the reality around them. Fundamentally, this boils down to emotional intelligence, intellectual intelligence, and physical intelligence. And modern society has kind of whittled away our emotional intelligence and physical intelligence, and that's a problem as we find ourselves back on the savannah, so to speak. So you might define intelligence as the ability to stay in the game, the ability to play the infinite game. It's less about qualifications, it's less about how well read you are, it's more about your street smartness, your ability to survive in inhospitable conditions, because that's kind of what we're going into. Our ancestors were naturally innovative. Their curiosity, their creativity, and courage and so on, they played the game very well. And the proof of that is that we're here today, thanks to them. And also, thanks to them, we are doing this event today in a well-appointed room and not a field or a cave. So, innovation is wired into us. And with increasing disruption, we're going to face increasingly novel situations. Novel situations require an innovative response. Innovation requires experimentation. The price of experimentation is failure. This is where the problem arises. Failure is anathema to efficiency. And we all, bow to efficiency. The question is, are you going to be able to get up to a failure velocity high enough to cope with increasing disruption? So that's an interesting KPI you might consider. Are you failing enough? So let's look at government, and let's keep it simple. Government is one of 4 primary actors in society. Now, this is very simplified. So citizens include civil society and voluntary services and so on. And a healthy society is where you have a mutually symbiotic relationship between all parties. Governments don't exist in isolation. But of course, this is complicated by all of those external macro-environmental forces, which are both compounding and conflating to make the world unknowable. So this is a big challenge, even with this very neat diagram. So if we drill a little further into government, it's not so clean looking. If we imagine each of these fingers to be departments, you can kind of understand why a silo mentality is adopted, because it's all about if I pull someone, I start dragging other people, and my budget, anything I gain, you lose, and so on. So there's this tension. And this model has kind of come about as a result of bureaucracy, legacy systems, even legacy thinking, as it were. And this is a simplified version of the government of Northern Ireland. If we imagine the right hand to be central government, well, there needs to be 9 hands there, with approximately 141 fingers. If we look on the left-hand side, local authorities, there needs to be 11 hands, each of those with about 40 services and responsibilities each. That gets very, very complicated. We're talking about approximately 600 moving parts. And this particular model is not flexible, it's not responsive, and it's not adaptive. That's a big problem. If we look at living organisms, and mammals typically have billions, if not trillions, of cells, they are somehow or other been able to operate in real time, very responsive, very flexible, and very adaptive. So the question then is, well, what can we learn from living systems? Well, there are some commonalities. If we take a department being the same as a cell, well, both have to provide a service, provide some sort of value. They have to do that within the context of limited resources, and they have to kind of communicate both internally and with other cells. And cells themselves are living organisms, so they are constantly sensing, deciding, and acting. The messages that come in determine the shape of the cell. They are very responsive to their environment. However, most departments, perhaps, well, that might be generalizing a bit too much, but a lot of departments think they're doing a good job because they're sticking to the strategic plan and they're failing to look out the window and see what's happening in practice. So when it comes to, if you like, designing good systems, as it were, we want to obviously go for simplicity, as simple as we can get, but no more than that. We want to go for high cohesion. That means that every department, every cell does one thing, does it very, very well, and has a high degree of autonomy. It doesn't want to be spending all its time sending messages backwards and forwards to head office to get permission to do things. So very decentralized. Low coupling, which means that we want to minimize the number of messages that are going backwards and forwards between the cells. So good cellular design will lead to minimalized messaging between the cells, and that's a good thing. The more coupling there is, the less flexible the system can be. Cells are highly adaptive. They don't just process the messages coming in, they look for trends in those messages and reconfigure themselves based on those messages. So the genetic expression changes as a result of the messages over time. So we want to be able to basically create departments that are self-managing, so to speak, self-maintaining. So they look after their own operations. They may use the services of other cells, but they're essentially responsible for their own operations. They fix their own problems. They clean their own waste. They recycle, let's say, broken proteins, and so on. So this isn't so much about a kind of massive transformation program across government. This is about developing individual departments that can stand on their own 2 feet, that are allowed to stand on their own 2 feet, and operate in line with what reality requires from them, as opposed to some multi-year plan. Now, turning to technology, technology can be used not just for automation, but for innovation as well. As new technologies emerge, they can create all sorts of opportunities for citizens. As a child of the 60s, I was expecting full anthropomorphic robots in the home by the year 2000. That hasn't happened, and I'm rather disappointed. In many respects, AI hasn't really advanced very much in the last 50 years. What we have seen are some maths parlor tricks, called machine learning primarily. Until we really understand how the brain works, how the mind, how consciousness, how intention works, what we have today in reality is artificial intelligence. And you can be sure that your carpet cleaning robots are not having thoughts of insurrection. But the truth is, we are seeing rapid advances in AI, in broad terms, and we are seeing some game-changing activity happening just over the last year, so to speak, starting to encroach on our ability to be creative and so on. We've seen professions, the acting profession in America, are up in arms about this, but they should have seen it coming with the arrival of cartoons. Some of us are going to be working with anthropomorphic robots in the office in the years to come. That's a reality. So when you come into work one morning and your robot coworker winks at you, is that a sign that they need to be rebooted? Or have they been programmed to know that you will work better if you form an emotional connection with this piece of tin? Or is it because their learning algorithm has picked up enough about your job to know it's your last day at the office? That's the world we're going into. There's a phase that we're going to go through where it's natural cognition plus artificial cognition. That's where we are at the moment, but at some point or other, we won't be needed from an economic perspective. And that's a whole thing that government needs to be thinking about. Turning back now to talent. We saw that the banks were in a race to the bottom, 100% efficient, 0% margin, and I think, well, how do we move back up the value stack again? Well, what they'll do is they'll start reintroducing people. But these people won't be compliant cogs for the machine. These are people whose thoughts and innovations give rise to differentiated citizen and customer experiences, and there'll be a little bit of a HR nightmare. These will be people like Salvador Dali, Lady Gaga, Pablo Picasso. Brilliant at what they do. Now, these people are essentially in the cognition business. Companies like Google and Amazon and Microsoft, they have realized they're in the cognition management business. Now, I'm not an anthropologist, but I've studied the work of anthropologists, and I've identified 9 human characteristics that if we exhibit them during the course of a working day, that would be considered a good day at the office. Essentially, these forward-thinking organizations have created cognitive gymnasiums. Their workplaces are cognitive gymnasiums where cognitive athletes go to work out with other great cognitive athletes, and where you guys become the cognitive coaches. In many respects, this is the future of talent management. Essentially, stressed people do not have much bandwidth for creativity and innovation. So this is a kind of cognitive reclamation exercise. The less anxiety I feel, the more bandwidth I have to do great work. We're all in the cognition management business. And I've described this in the context of the workplace. This, of course, applies to communities as well. If we create communities or let communities emerge that are essentially distressful, creating anxiety, well, the more of our bandwidth that's used in being anxious, the less bandwidth we've got for being civil, for being graceful, for being basically innovative and creating thriving communities. So this principle applies to the architecture of our communities as well. Turning now to leadership. As I mentioned before, the old model, very centralized leadership model. Hollywood has promoted a heroic leader type approach, and many of us have bought into that. Somehow or other, our leaders are just simply better than us, and we can rely on them to make all the decisions. We just do what we're told. That's an existential single point of failure, because if things don't work out for the leader, the organization as a whole has a problem. So we need a more decentralized approach to leadership, a more distributed approach, a more ubiquitous approach. The person who's closest to the ball, or the balls, is the leader at that point in time. That's where we need to get to. We need to think less about leaders as individuals and leadership as a system for sensing, deciding, and acting in real time. When I'm, for whatever reason, holding a red-hot poker, my hand doesn't need to get permission from the executive function, i.e. my brain, to let go. That's the only way you can operate in a rapidly changing world. Very decentralized leadership. Very quickly on assets. A lot of organizations are focused on making a profit. A lot of public sector organizations are focused on keeping within budget. Perhaps our emphasis should change and focus on growing assets. And these assets might include brand capital, building trust with society, data capital, making sure you're using data, creating value, cognitive capital, your people. There's all sorts of different types of capital that you can be thinking of. Amazon sees your wallet as an asset and it wants to own it. Facebook, similarly, with your mind. If you focus on growing assets, you have a buffer against an uncertain future. You can take more risks, and you can acquire and retain the best people. And of course, we need to pay attention to the asset on which all the other assets depend, the planet. So, this is how we are in society at the moment, a very centralized leadership approach, particularly in the private sector. A handful of people are making all the big decisions. Decisions are equated to value production, so all the value is being created centrally. Therefore, all the rewards go to a handful of people. This leads to economic inequality and social disparity. If we had a more ubiquitous approach, then more people are involved in decision making, more people are involved in value production, more people are involved in the rewards distribution. This is good economically and socially. This is, I would say, the strongest case for distributed leadership. And of course, centralized leadership is the squandering of your organization's cognitive capital. Having your people doing robot work instead of applying their brain is simply a waste. So, in summary, this is where we are. It's not good. This is where we need to get to. Focus on growing assets, have a more ubiquitous leadership approach, create departments, create organizations that are living, sensing organisms, sensitive to their environment. Nothing wrong with process, nothing wrong with automation, it's just not enough. And we should be using technology to innovate as well. Treating our people less as cogs, more as cognitive athletes, of course, is very, very important. This innovative experimental approach is more explorative and therefore more sustainable. We're playing the infinite game, and you might ask, well, why have I not put utopian? Well, the reality is in utopia you have freedom and security. What's happening here in reality is we are trading security for freedom. So goodbye comfort, goodbye convenience, hello precarity, hello danger, hello liberation, hello being human again. In many respects, disruption has come to save us from ourselves. So the world is changing, it's becoming more disrupted. We're going to have to change radically in the way we operate. We're becoming more augmented. The 20th century was the era of IT. The 21st century is the era of biology, what with genomics, bionics, bioinformatics, even nootropics. The augmentations we're going to see over the next few years will be profound. And that has profound implications for us as service providers, as consumers, as citizens, and in that most exacting of management sciences, parenting. So, in essence, we need to create intelligent organizations that are staffed with cognitive athletes. We need to re-embrace our humanity in ways that we haven't done for 300 years. In essence, we need intelligent leaders. So, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to let you go at this stage so we can keep cracking on, but thank you an awful lot to digest there. I think a lot to unsettle us, the odd thing to reassure us. I'm particularly reassured by the fact that my robotic vacuum cleaner isn't about to lead an insurrection in the Fitzpatrick household. Plenty of others will do that. But no, thank you very much indeed. I'm reminded of just some of the changes I've seen in my own career, and these are just technological changes. When I was training just out of school, the newspaper industry, which existed at the time, was going through a thing called direct input, which was this amazing idea that journalists could be allowed to input directly onto a computer without having a layer of production which involved print workers. And that was, some of you might remember all the strikes and Eddie Shah and Rupert Murdoch and so on back in the 80s fighting with the print unions. That was about. And fast forward to the restoration of devolution in 2007. I don't know if any of you remember Devolution Day in May 2007. Perhaps some of you captured the moment on your iPhones. Well, actually, you didn't, because the iPhone wasn't even operational. It came out a month later in June. So those are the kind of changes we've seen just since devolution was last restored. What are we going to see over the next decade or so? A hint from Aid as to what we're going to see and how we need to respond. So from the unpredictable to predictions, it is budget day, and so we have this scenario today where the Chancellor gets up and makes a whole load of predictions about how much money he's going to raise, how much money he's going to spend, and of course we have to believe that he knows what he's talking about. But of course life intervenes along the way. But in the meantime, we suffer and feel and enjoy the consequences, but also spare a thought for those poor civil servants who have to manage the whole thing. So we're absolutely delighted today to have somebody who is no better person to have on budget day and no better day to have them. And he will take a few questions afterwards. Ladies and gentlemen, Neil Gibson.
Well, good morning, everyone. I feel a little bit unsettled by what I've just heard, although I think that may well have been the purpose. And I'm not sure I present a great vision of the future of modern leadership. But what I am going to try and do in the next 10 or 15 minutes, give you a little bit of a flavour of the financial situation we find ourselves in and what that, I believe, presents as a leadership challenge for us in the room. And I will reflect a little bit on what I just heard because I think it's a very important message about what we do with the staff that we have the privilege of leading. I'm also clearly the warm-up act for FM and DFM coming soon, so I hope that I can set the table for them to present their vision and their hope for the sort of change and delivery model that they're aiming to bring to bear. But I don't want to set those expectations out too depressingly, despite my Dr. Doom moniker. I hope that I will provide a little bit of positivity amongst some of the perilous financial situations that we find ourselves in. Because actually, it is scarce resources that do lead us to make behavioural changes. I believe I wasn't able to join last night, but I believe a lot of that conversation was about the need to engage our citizens and the need for us, indeed, as workers and public sector workers to remember that we are working for the public, and therefore, how do we make sure that what we're delivering is what we're being asked to deliver and what people require? Now, the financial position, I'm afraid, isn't a particularly rosy one. Although I struggle to find any time in which I could stand up here and say it would be ever any way different. There's always, to go back to our Economics 101, an infinite level of wants for a scarce level of resources. So there's always going to be a level of prioritisation, decision-making, choice that has to be done. Now, a lot have heard about the package that was secured to bring the executive back, and 3.3 billion has been quoted a lot to talk about this sort of wall of money that should be here to help. And make no bones about it, 3.3 billion is a lot of money for a place the size of Northern Ireland. Now, I'm not going to go and unpick all those numbers, but a lot of that is to pay for the cost of running the services today, the pay rises that were announced correctly, in my view. I'll say a little bit about that in a minute. This year, pay off a debt, in inverted commas, from last year, and some future promises about Barnett's and consequential money that would have been coming anyway. What essentially we have is a £1 billion stabilisation fund to be deployed over the next 2 years. But if we look at our finances today, we're spending £1 billion more than we originally had in our budget. That's now been met in this package. So if you want to put it crudely, we have £1 billion of pressures, but only £500 million of money. Now, that's a very big simplification. We're going to get some Barnett consequentials today. We're going to have some other money to deploy next year. But essentially, we don't need to worry. People mentioned earlier about keeping it simple. We don't need to worry too much about the mechanics, except to say that the quantum of asks is going to far outstrip the available resource that's there. You will also have heard a lot of fixation about the 113 million or the revenue raising ask that has been put in, or conditionality that's been put in. And the big debate is for our political leaders, how much of that is it? How much are you required to do? Otherwise, past debts will not be written off. I mean, I'm not going to oversimplify it, but to be crude, it doesn't really matter whether they were asked to do 113 million of revenue raising or not. When you look at the scale of pressures we have in delivery, we will need more money to deliver them. We can look at efficiencies, we can look at transformation, and that's absolutely the journey we must be on. But the question is not whether there's a requirement to raise any money. There is an absolute necessity to raise more money for the nature, structure and demands that we have from service delivery at this point in time. I could take you around every single department, and none of them would, and mine included, would not have a scale of financial pressure within them. And you can think about what that is. The obvious ones are the demand pressures we see on our health service as we live longer, as we advance in medicine, more expensive, more costly. So it's essentially a demand problem. If we look at our education system, you'll have heard many commentary in the press around the pressures we face around our schools' estates, or our special education provision, or the mental health support in our schools. If I take you to the policing numbers, if I take you to climate change, if I take you to helping the most vulnerable, and if I take you to my sort of old area of expertise, the economy, which ultimately is trying to drive the generation of the tax base that we can redistribute money from, then there is no department that couldn't stand up here very legitimately and make a case to say we need considerable and significant additional funding. So that means, to pick up on Aidan's presentation, we're going to have to think a bit differently. There is no mechanism I can give my minister that's going to fairly and reasonably weight and score every pressure. Is a pothole more valuable to be fixed than it is to fund the arts, than it is to fund education or fund the health service? There's no fair and equitable way of creating a weighting and scoring matrix to do that. What we've got to do is make sure we can look the taxpayer in the eye and say, the money that you have provided, we have done the very, very best that we can do with that amount of money. And for that to be true, we are absolutely going to need ideas, suggestions, creativity, courage, things that we're not normally building into the system. And if I'm being frank, and you won't be surprised in this, I get to see many of the letters that are written, most of them, into the minister for requests. If I drew a pie chart of how many of those ask for more money, it would be virtually all of them. So whatever the problems you've heard about, Minister, these are definitely the most egregious. And many of them very well articulated, very moving in many cases, and you think, okay, that's definitely the most prioritous, until the next letter comes in the next day. And worryingly, that type of letter writing also then diminishes some of the underpinnings of what we deliver that nobody really thinks about, that actually underpins our ability to do things better. So in other words, the crisis always outweighs the long-term planning for being able to educate our people or provide the kind of support at the beginning that stops the problem ever emerging, the kind of prevention rather than cure. So it's an incredibly difficult world in which we're trying to make incredibly difficult decisions. So from a leadership point of view, what does that mean for us as public servants, and what do we have to do? Well, it's much better that we now have elected representation back to make the decisions on our citizens' behalf, but that doesn't diminish the pressure on all of us in this room. In fact, it increases it, because they've got to make decisions based on evidence that predominantly they're relying on us to provide. Fair, impartial, well-evidenced research or analytics to demonstrate what choice A might be compared to choice B. In many cases, they may be very difficult. And in some of the early conversations over coffee, I was discussing about the value, and many, Nicole and others, referencing how important this room can be in getting close to citizens and starting that expectation journey about why some of these decisions are as difficult and as challenging as they are. But what I wanted to reflect on a little bit, and I'm only reflecting on it really because of the previous speech and thinking about how do we get to that change of mentality and change of state in terms of how we think. And there are things we can do, and I know some of my senior team are in the room, and I hope they feel that the style of leadership I've hoped to have brought to my department is more devolved, empowering, and being led by whoever is closest to the ball. But it's more than that. It is a very, very difficult time to be a leader in public service. The amount of criticism is extraordinary, and that is, I don't care how robust and resilient you are, incredibly difficult for many people to bear. So we can think about being courageous and being brave and trying new things, but by goodness, if you get that wrong, will your face be over every single online outlet or newspaper? And we can say, well, it's our job to be courageous, and it is. But how do we encourage those people forward who might have the best ideas, but the last thing they want is the spotlight of that? And that can be really, really challenging. Being able to be sure that I stand in front of a lot of very brilliant people making fantastic decisions, sometimes having to take the public role because they don't want to be in that position. That is an incredibly difficult cultural and psychological change in an organisation, to say, I will back you, I will support you, but I know the level of critique you will get, the amount of criticism of who spent what, or why this wasn't delivered on time, or what went wrong, and the absolute laser focus on finding out who was the actual person we could blame for that makes it incredibly difficult to get some of that courageous and creative leadership that we need. In fact, for us in public service, and many of you in the room will recognise this, it's getting extraordinarily hard to encourage people to apply for some of those roles. I've done some leadership positions within my own organisation in which previously incredibly prestigious jobs within public service, public finances and elsewhere, 1, 2, 3 applications because the knowledge of just how unpleasant that role has become. And that's a society problem for us here in Northern Ireland, about resetting what it means to be courageous, creative leaders and to be able to make decisions and make choices, trying to get back to, in some ways, it's getting back to basics, as we heard in the previous session, is what are we here to do? To survive, to find a better way to stretch these resources, go back to our quote-unquote kind of code of ethics. What are we really here to try and do? That's what I try to keep in my head when I'm making decisions. What are we actually here to deliver? Not how will this play out or who'll be cross. Now, I promised I wouldn't be too downbeat, and I'm not going to be, because what you're going to hear today, if you do, and you should spend some time with the exhibitors and also through the cafe conversations, there are pockets of absolute brilliance all around the system that many in this room are responsible for. Some of them not even sure or not even aware of the absolute brilliance of what they are delivering. And it's been the greatest privilege of my entire professional career these last 2 years to be able to go in and see the surprising brilliance that has come out in many of these areas. You're going to hear digital success stories in the health service. You're going to hear about transformation in data collection and data delivery. You're going to hear a whole load of great stories about how community empowerment and new design-led thinking has created new pathways for decision making. So there is loads and loads of brilliant things. We don't spend a lot of time on that. But what I hope I would, and I think a really important thing to say on a day like today, is what we have to connect ourselves back to is the difference that we are making. And whenever this leadership job feels a bit overwhelming to me, which it does frequently, you go out with another perm secretary, you go out and you visit some of the things that are actually being delivered and done. And Northern Ireland has a lot of truly, truly brilliant transformations underway, transformations planned. What I hopefully laid out is the financial reality is that's going to have to be the norm. We simply will not be able, there is no mathematical way I can suggest that I can predict a tax base that's going to keep up with the cost of demand on its current trajectory. It's just not possible. You know, if our health service's inflation is growing at 5% a year, well, I need 300 to 350 million a year to fund that. Now, 15% on the rates only gets you 113, as everybody now knows. So just how much would you put on the rates every year just to chase that health inflation cost? That's not an option. The creativity, the brilliance, the genius that you're going to hear about today, the inspiration of that is what we've got to take forward. We've got to find more airtime to spend time talking about what's been successful and what's worked, and a little bit less on trying to find who can we blame for the thing that went wrong. Because as we heard in the previous speech, we're going to have to try quite a lot of things, not all of which will work, to be able to be adaptable and say, okay, tried that, didn't work. Lots of, test and learn and pilot type approaches. So for me, I think the tone that I want to send today is I could have spent a long time with lots of my blessed slides and talked about the financial situation, talked fiscal floors, talked about the financial position, and happy to take a few questions if we have time. But what I more wanted to draw out was the fact that what we need is the energy in the room to say, Right, what can we heard a great message this morning about who else could you have spoken to who could maybe do that together? Because we'll always say the government's silos, but the asks are siloed too. So 10 people will ask us for the same funding for the same thing. And we can't fix that. We need you to come and ask for one thing. So that ability to have new conversations and to check. And yes, of course, with my economist hat on, we do have a need to find ways to save money and to find a better way forward. I want to reassure David it wasn't me that stole his wiper blades, but if I had, they would have been unvinted and gone back into the public purse. We will need to do very well in the next few years in terms of supporting our returning elected members, to give them the evidence and the support for the tough decisions that they've got to make, but also to help celebrate some of the successes that we're already beginning to deliver across public service. Thank you so much for listening to me ramble for a little bit, and if we have a minute or two, happy to take some questions.
Thanks. Now we've got you, we'll not let you away just yet. Yeah, thank you. A lot to think about there, and actually I think you're right, bringing out the key challenges there. It's not just about the numbers, it's about kind of what the people in this room can do in terms of leadership. Let me just, before I'm going to come to some questions, how do we think, and we'll get into the audience. Anne's over here, and Heather's here with a microphone, so please catch my eye on a moment. But just before I jump out there, you mentioned that fact that there's always going to be more pressing need, and the problem is that the crisis kind of intervene from that more strategic, let's make sure that we focus our resources over here. What's your sense? Devolution's back. We've been kind of early days, but what's your sense? Are they going to be up for those kind of tough decisions that they're going to have to be made?
Yes is my answer to that, in the sense that the decisions, the things that any elected official would want to do can't be done without some tough decisions along the way. And we heard mention of the pandemic earlier. I think we do have recent experience of showing that actually once we face into some of those crises, we can take some really good learnings out of that about how to move and operate rather differently. So there's a little bit of sense of, okay, it may be very difficult, but what way does that give us a chance to repivot or do things a little bit differently? And certainly in our engagements with elected officials so far, there is an enthusiasm to say, right, okay, if you have to be elected, you have to be seen to be making progress. And our job is to make that not seem so daunting or so impossible. And it's good that we've got some very recent examples of being able to say, not everything is materially worse than it was. In fact, many things are materially better. So let's try and give a little bit of that hope in, and that gives us a little bit of support for some of the more difficult decisions that need to be taken. What I want to be really clear about is you don't take difficult decisions without very well evidenced material to make that decision on, and that's the responsibility that we still hold. There's a lot of people saying, oh, it must be better for you now, Neil, officials are... The job's harder because the decisions are there to be taken now, but they have to be taken from a base of proper evidence, and that's our job to provide them.
Thanks. Okay, so who wants a question before we go to the break? Hands up. Yep, just here. Thank you.
Thanks, Heather. Morning, Neil. Gráinne Long from the Housing Executive. So, Neil, I've never felt it was my job to deliver just housing outputs. That's fundamentally what we do. So our job in the Housing Executive is to help other organisations deliver in the best interests of our community. So that's a given. I'm really excited. I think there's a huge amount ahead in terms of delivering. I think we'll do some brilliant work with health in the next year, focused specifically on young people in care, leaving care. So that's our offer, and it's what we should be doing, so we shouldn't get any awards for that. I think if I had an ask, my ask would be, and I'm really interested to hear from you, how, as we put propositions together, housing and health together, how those propositions will be considered differently, and we will have to do that differently, to enable us to push our resources together, to manage demand, to get in there as early as possible in terms of prevention. But it will mean different approaches in terms of how business cases, and I hate to use the word, but how the proposition is considered by your department. So I'm interested in hearing what your thinking is on that, and what you think will need to change, and how we can support you in doing that.
Thank you, Gráinne. And there is a challenge for us in the way that we consume business cases out of different particular funding envelopes. But actually, and hopefully some will have seen, certainly in the advice we've been given, and certainly my minister been very supportive of this, increasingly meeting jointly. So a lot of times we've had letters of meeting coming into different ministers, and I've been trying to provide the advice back. Speak to your colleague in the other department, and so if you're going to have that meeting, have it with the two departments at the same time. It does make our challenge a little bit, tracing back the money to where it's coming from. So you're absolutely right. We have work to do in terms of how we accommodate more complex and multi-dimensional business cases. But it shouldn't dissuade from your main point, which is that is exactly how we should approach this. This is the issue that we're facing, and almost none of the societal problems I could talk about could I put them in a neat department's bucket. So you're absolutely right that that's the way we need to go, and it requires me to make sure, when I do my one-to-ones, which are coming up, by the way, for any of my senior leaders as we reach the end of the financial year, when you're doing your one-to-one leadership, one of my first questions to all my staff is, who did you meet outside of this department? Who have you been spending time with this year, building relationships with? Because it's fine, we're all friends in the DOF family, so that's not going to change the dial. Who else are you meeting? So these events, these things are important, talking to people in different, all the solutions are multi-dimensional, but you do make a good point about business cases.
Neil Noel-Brady, Public Sector Chairs Forum. Neil, talked a lot today, both speakers, about creativity and trying to be more efficient, etc., through creativity. In the 80s and 90s, very strong collaboration between the public sector and private sector in terms of market testing and outsourcing of large elements of public sector services and working together. That has become less fashionable in the last couple of decades, but do you see that in this new arena of looking at all options as making a bit of a comeback, or do you think it's just politically not a runner?
No, I don't think anything can be off the table. I mean, it's a finite set of resources and certain talents, and there are simple tasks and questions that it's unlikely every organisation could hire the same people to do the same task. There are a finite number of them. So there'll be plenty of things that will be very difficult to deliver purely in a public sense. For me, it becomes less about the designation of whether it's public, private, voluntary. What's the thing that needs solved? What are the options on the table for doing that? And how can we then craft a way to make that work? I think we'll begin to see the lines blurring between, when I'm meeting a contractor, for example, when they're doing work, I kind of don't want to see the join lines between the contractor and the public servants that are working on it. So we'll begin to be much more, rather than a commissioning arrangement, strategic partnerships. And we are seeing that develop where our partners who are delivering on the citizens' behalf can be much more embedded into the system so that they understand and work with the pressures that we face. So whilst I wouldn't put it as a comeback, I think the numbers and the maths tell us we can't be too evangelical about exactly how things are delivered. One thing, though, is very important, is when we think of our own public sector staff that I obviously represent from a personnel point of view, we also have to equip them and support them for the change that is coming, whether that's working in tandem with private sector or third sector partners, or whether it's delivering the services themselves. As Abe told us, the world is fundamentally changing, so we need to provide the training and support for them to be available to think about those new types of jobs and new ways of working. But I've looked at the things that we need in public service. There's almost no task. When I think of my kids at school, there's no job that they could be training to do that the public sector doesn't need. Whether it delivers it or not is a different question. So I think we need to start to lose a little bit of the distinction between who's delivering it and focus rather more on what the outcome is.
Thanks. Eddie O'Neill, Technology Department of Health. Is there not an element of the system is perfectly designed to deliver the poor outcomes that we get? And that's the fundamental problem we start with. If we look, for instance, under De Hont, we have each department run as a separate fiefdom, whereas many of the problems we have, such as mental health, touch on many areas, whether it's education, whether it's criminal justice. It's not just a problem within health, yet we look to solve those problems within one department. So that's an issue about how you get that cross-cooperation and engender people around cooperative working. The other issue we have is in terms of process and funding cycles. Annual budgets don't allow time for saving to invest and reinvest and improve efficiency. Unless we have longer funding cycles, you just can't do anything effective.
Yeah, I think taking those in reverse order, the second one's a very well-made point. I mean, we're going to have to move into a world of multi-year budgeting. All the elected officials have talked about that. You align that with spending cycles, yes, but ultimately you can think ahead about what your spending envelope's likely to be in terms of the overall picture. So there's no reason for not starting to think about being much more multi-year in terms of what we think about. Your point about the system being set up, again, above my pay grade to discuss the system structure, but what I would say is it's amazing how silos can be created no matter what the system structure is. I even have to work to unpick them in my own department. So one minister, one department, but different buildings, different. There is a system. We always think it'll be easier if it was just one big happy family. There is a point where that family gets too big. So if you thought we had only one department, I would struggle to think how we'd even get our arms around that. So there is silo mentality doesn't just exist because we don't want to talk to other people. It's sitting at, well, I often say, well, could I work more collaboratively? What would be the biggest obstacle to that? Not enough hours in the day. I have no break in my schedule. So if you said to me, well, we're going to have more meetings because you've now a bigger structure. So I think you make a very good point, but I also remind ourselves it's about that interaction of sales too. How do we make that coupling as effective as it can be? But the idea that just one giant sale would do it, I don't think is workable either, because the issues would be too complex. The last thing I would say on that is a responsibility for all of us to work against the silo mentality. I have never had my minister say to me, don't meet X or what, never. So if I'm not meeting people and my team are not engaging with colleagues in other departments, that's on me as the leader of those people. So we all have a role to play in breaking down silo mentalities. It's not something that has to be done just by the structure that's given to us.
Hello, my name is Julia Anna Martin and I'm here representing the Boardroom Apprentice. First I'd like to thank Neil Gibson, Jim Fitzpatrick and Dixon, who's handing out the microphone, and Heather Murhead for handing out the microphones for everybody today. My question is, and it's going to cause a bit of controversy, but I think I've got a bit of solution. I think that there's streamlining needs to happen within the civil service. One of the companies that I work for, they've recently undertaken a huge amount of streamlining of the services, and there's been major job cuts. And obviously nobody wants to hear job cuts, but because of the streamlining, there's been so much more efficiency and less having to go to different departments to get things done. So my question is, do we need to have a more streamlined service in the civil service? Because I have friends that work in the civil service and they can say, oh, it's jolly. Like, I can do all my work in the day and just prance about my phone all day, to be honest with you. And that's the honest truth. And I'm not going to sit here and lie to you. I mean, that's what people say on the shop floor to any of the leaders. I'm not going to name names, but, Anyway, that's my question. If anybody wants to reach out to me, I'm Julia Martin, jmartin646@hotmail.com. But anyway, I was about to give my phone number out, that's too much. Okay, that's my question. Okay.
Do we need to be like the new president of Argentina, get the big chainsaw?
Well, look, there is obviously, streamlining is a question we could raise across the piece. Normally for me, the way you have to think about this from a personnel point of view, as you would do in a business, what are we stopping doing that we can then redeploy the people? What I can tell you is there are areas in the public service we simply cannot get people to apply and to work in now, because they're not competitive enough. So therefore, we can redeploy people, we can support them, train them to move into those jobs. It is important, and it's incumbent on all of us as leaders to have our organisations working as effectively and as efficiently as possible. I hope that person's not in DOF. But we do have a journey of performance improvement across public service required. No organisation has everything perfect. But what I would say is it's extraordinary when you raise the prospect of cutting anything, I mean anything, how much opposition there will be to that. And ultimately, you take your staff out when you no longer need that function. And of all those letters I went back to on that pie chart, the number of them that said that here's the things we don't need anymore is 0. So there is a hard journey. Efficiency is a word that's thrown about easily, but actually delivering that level of change requires really strong leadership, clarity of purpose, and an ability to redeploy to where your staff are needed. So my first priority from personnel point of view is to get our people to where they're needed most, trained and supported to do so. But absolutely, we do have, like every other organisation, efficiency journeys to meet.
Great stuff. Ladies and gentlemen, Gibson.
Thank you.
Time for a break now, and we will be back here again just at 10 past 11. I think we're back in business. Yep. So if you want to go and grab a coffee, you may even. Yeah, we might allow you at 11:15. Make sure you get round the exhibition, grab a tea, grab a coffee, grab a chat. See you back here for the First Minister and Deputy First Minister. Thank you.
Oh God, well, I'm there, right?
All right, Heather has given me the bell, which is very kind of you. It reminds me of being back in the school playground, but time to sit down and we'll crack on with the show. It's actually always a good sign when people are not necessarily returning late. I'm not giving you license to do this again, but it is a good sign when people are talking and meeting and keen to engage, because that's really what a big part of today is all about. So I was lucky enough to be here last year. I also have been involved at times when, this conference and others have been held online. It's great not to be doing that anymore, but it's also good to be holding a conference about leadership in the public sector in Northern Ireland when devolution has been restored. So we're delighted to be able to welcome the newly appointed leaders in the Executive Office, the First and Deputy First Minister. We've got Michelle O'Neill and Emma Little-Pengelly with us here, so a very big welcome to them. And I'm just going to hand over to both of them in a moment, where they will set out their priorities, their emerging priorities, I suppose, for this new executive and this new term of office. And after that, we're going to get digging into the big conversation where there'll be a bit of work to be done at the tables and where your ideas will be fed back into the room. So, ladies and gentlemen, if I could hand over to Michelle O'Neill.
Thank you very much, Jim, and thank you to everybody for the invitation to be here this morning. You're very much like the headmaster getting on there with the bell. He even took it with him. He's not relinquishing control of it either. Really delighted to be here with you this morning. Sadly, we won't be able to stay because we're going off to another engagement. And what we've very quickly realised this is our 5th week, what we very quickly realised is that we never get to stay anywhere for very long. We get to come in and share some words and listen to some experiences. But it's very much, I think, the tenure of what we're trying to set and the tone that we're trying to set from very early on is one of positivity, one of being constructive, one of working together, and one very much about partnership, which I know that you all are very equally interested in. So we're conscious of the fact that we're coming behind Neil, and we hope that he hasn't, dampened spirits too much, because I'm sure he was pointing out the reality of the challenges that we have. But also, I think there are opportunities for us too. So we're going to have to try to straddle both of those things and get a good balance and going forward. Certainly in terms of the finances and how we are funded, that's a collective battle for us as an executive, and one that we're determined to take on together. So we need a proper funding model to keep doing all the things that we all want to do. So just to assure you of our commitment around that. And then I think Aid also talked about, and I thought it was interesting just to read the wee preamble in the brochure, but certainly about leadership falls to the person who's closest to the ball. And whilst that's the case, I think, across many spheres of life, certainly for us in politics, we have to make the decisions, but we also need to know where to go and to work in partnership to actually hear the actual real perspective of people on the ground who are delivering services. So we very much value that, and we hope that will be, again, a factor of our leadership. You're all here because you're leaders in your own right. You're all here because of your service to public, voluntary and community sectors, and you're all people who have shown resilience, particularly over the last number of years, which have been very challenging times, and we've all had to adapt, and you've had to adapt in your areas in terms of finding innovative ways to do things to address the unprecedented challenges, the cost of living crisis, the pandemic itself. So just to say from the outset, thank you. Thank you for that. It doesn't go unnoticed. It's very much appreciated by us all. And Emma and I certainly want, as I said, we want to set the right tone. We want to work in partnership. We want to work with all of you, because ultimately what we all want to do is deliver for citizens. And we also are very conscious of the fact there's an awful lot to do, and we have a very large in-tray of areas to work through. But we believe that we'll be able to do that with partnership. We have 2 roles in the executive. One, to try to work with all the parties of the executive and try to lead that executive, and then secondly, within our own department itself. And both of our speeches, when we took up office, chimed in terms of the areas that we wanted to certainly work on together: childcare, reducing waiting lists in our health service, ensuring that every child with special educational needs has a place in a school, among many, many, many other areas that we want to focus on. But we genuinely believe that in working in partnership, we all collectively, you all in this room and ourselves in the political world, have a role to play in sort of shaping the type of society that we live in. It's about, I come at politics for and make decisions based on what I think is good for my family as equally as it is for yours. It's about society as a whole. So we're all trying to make this a great place in which we live. You want to create and foster that spirit out there among citizens of respect and of equality. And the other area that we have that we really want to focus on, and hopefully will be one of our first big things to come out of our department itself, is our strategy around tackling violence against women and girls. And as a mother and a granny, that's something that I am so mindful of. So it's important that, I was thinking about this week, International Women's Day on Friday, so happy International Women's Day to all the women in the room. And we're very conscious that that's an occasion for us to reflect on how far society has changed over the last number of years, but also to reflect on how far we still have to go. But certainly for me, International Women's Day is one of those times where we, again, should be recommitting ourselves to actual deliverables, actions, things that actually improve women's lives. And certainly we want to be very focused on that. We're very glad that one of our first things that we were able to do as an executive was to bring forward the £688 million package to deliver fair pay for public sector workers. And whilst, there'll never be enough money in the pot, we thought that that would send a good signal, and we hope that it does, that we are determined to try to deliver fair pay for all of our public sector workers. As I said, we know that there are challenges for the economy and for people, and the last few years have been a struggle for everybody. But I'm also somebody who likes to keep looking forward. You have to always reflect backwards, but you have to keep looking forward. And for me, I think we should all be very optimistic about the future. I think that I see it every day. In the 5 weeks that I've been First Minister, but in all my time as an elected representative, I see amazing people every day out there doing their thing. And we're so fortunate that we get the chance to meet so many people in their different walks of life. And this room is no different, a room full of entrepreneurial spirit, energetic and successful business people, people who put themselves forward into public roles, and it takes us all. We all bring something to the table. Last week I was in Turex, which is just on the border of my own constituency, but it's a global company that has been employing people, nearly 2,000 staff across a number of sites. And it's a company that's grown from strength to strength, and a company that actually really inspires the workers that come in through their front doors to stay with them, to stick the pace, because they invest in the staff. And to me, that is testimony to the type of opportunities that we have in going forward. And we think about the economy and we think about the opportunities that we have ahead of us, of which there are many. We have our new economy minister in post, who has now set out his vision for how he will move forward, and he set out an economic mission. And included in some of his key objectives are increasing the number of working age people who are in good jobs, well-paid jobs, because it's not just good enough to have a job, it has to be a job that actually pays well. It's about promoting regional balance so that everybody shares in prosperity. It can't be centred in one area, it needs to be spread right across. It's about raising productivity, and it's about transition to net zero. And I think all those combination of things can drive our economy upwards. And I think, again, very much written into the core and the centre of what he wants to achieve in terms of his economic mission is very much this theme of partnership working, that we get more done when we work together. So we want to continue to explore all these opportunities, the opportunity that we have with dual market access, everything that we have ahead of us, we have to grab with both hands to try to improve people's lives. And as I said, you all have your role to play in all of that and making this a better place. And I just wanted to say to you that you have my commitment to work tirelessly with you to try to find the best solutions that suit the needs of the people that we all look after. And I think that it's so important for us in politics, given the stop-start nature of it over the past, and you can't shy away from those realities. But I think as we look towards the future, as I said, Emma and I have been very determined to set the right tone and actually get it off to the best possible start, because we know there will be many difficult challenges ahead for us. But we'll take those on and we'll do our best, because ultimately I believe politics is about letting people know that you have their back, letting people know that you're going to do your best, and letting people know why you arrive at a decision point, even if they don't agree with you. If they at least can understand how you came at that point, then at least that goes some way to understanding. So this is for us about building better futures, improving people's lives, creating hope and opportunity, because people need to get up in the morning and know that there's hope and opportunity ahead, and that we can change things that aren't perhaps working correctly. So that's the challenge for us. As I said, I commit to you to do our very, very best, and I commit to you to work in partnership, and I hope and I believe that we can achieve far so much more when we take that attitude, and that we all understand everybody's strengths and what everybody brings to the table. So thank you very much for having us this morning, and I'll hand over to the Deputy First Minister.
Thank you, Michelle, and good morning, everyone. I look around this room and there are so many people with so much influence, the collective power that is in this room right now in terms of the people who shape policy, the people who implement, the people who deliver, And that's an incredible thing because we know, of course, we have been through a period of instability. And as Michelle has said, as we've set about this task now in our week 5, we wanted to set a very, very positive tone. We know, as Michelle has acknowledged, that I think everyone wants hope for the future, hope that we are able to navigate our way through significant challenges. And as Michelle has rightly pointed out, we know that we can only do that by working hand in hand, shoulder to shoulder, with our local councils, with our businesses, our civic leaders, our organisations. You know, in this room, there are hundreds of people who shape people's lives on a day-to-day basis, and you know that. Very often it's not acknowledged, but we want to acknowledge that here this morning and say a huge thank you for the stability that you have shown as well in your roles in difficult days through the last number of years. And we look forward to working constructively with you, not just in our joint leadership of the executive, but across that and around that executive table. The world is going through a tremendous period of change with economic uncertainty, geopolitical conflict, the impact of climate change and technological disruption. But 2024 is also a year where around 50% of the democratic world will head to the polls, meaning even more uncertainty around global markets, international cooperation and policy priorities. This will undoubtedly be a year of significant change. But it is in that context that I believe that positive, constructive and responsible leadership is really needed right across all of our services and organisations. All of us in this room have a responsibility to lead, to inspire and act in the wider interest, whether as leaders of the executive, arm's length bodies, shaping policy, supporting communities or helping our economy grow. And we do so, and we're so acutely aware of this, and I've no doubt Neil has highlighted this morning. We do so in a context where public finances are challenging, and yet we all know that the demands on our public services continue to grow. To meet this challenge, we need to be resilient, innovative and determined. We need to harness creativity and work together to solve the problems and realise transformative opportunities. You know, I came into politics some 17 years ago now as a policy advisor, and I can only extend my apologies to all of the many civil servants who are now working in many different roles who worked with me at that time. But you know, I came in and I am unapologetically really, really passionate policy wonk. I love policy. I love the development of policy. I love looking at where policies have worked or haven't worked elsewhere. It's a genuine interest of mine. And unfortunately for many people who sit beside me at various dinners and whatnot, they listen to and have to listen to that genuine interest. But I truly believe that getting the right policies well designed by speaking to the right people and implemented in the right way is what is really going to transform our public services at every level. And that is such an incredibly important thing. There's no doubt being out and about and speaking to people, especially those who end up using those public services, there is a sense of frustration very often. They don't feel that their public services necessarily work as well as they can work. We know that public finances are incredibly difficult, and therefore the idea of just pushing more and more money towards some of those services that it's not achieving the outcomes we want them to achieve is not the solution. But what the solution is that working together collaboratively, getting those new ideas around policy design to really identify the right interventions at the right time in the right place. And that will be critical in terms of the ambitious programme of public sector transformation, of growing the economy that I know Michelle and I share. I am a firm believer that true leadership is not simply about wielding power, but it is about the ability to empower others and work in partnership with the collective sense of purpose. I have seen dramatic changes in that 17 years, and I'm sure every single one of you in this room has seen that as well in terms of policy development. Whereas before we would have looked at what we had done within the system and proposed solutions, went out to consultation, some of groups may or may not have put in a written submission to that. That has dramatically changed around concepts of co-design, of co-production, around that idea of getting out there and disrupt the way that we think, because of course we all think we have the solutions. But that challenge function is so important. And right from the outset, and I've said this at a number of events, that in Northern Ireland, particularly in political leadership, the differences that we have is very often seen as a weakness. It can cause slow decision making, difficult decision making, or perhaps no decision at all. But in fact, when we look at policy development, when we look at the way now that businesses and public sector and organisations throughout the globe talk about good decision making, it very often includes integrating and the inclusion of that difference in the room when the decisions are being made, when the policies are being developed. And why is that? Because that disrupts our thinking. In fact, and I've said this before, I think that our difference can in fact be our superpower in our executive, because we are bringing to the table those very different experiences, different roles that we have played at all levels of government, the different policies that we are passionate about, the different people and organisations that we speak to. And I actually think if we approach this in the right way, a constructive way of saying, look, let's try to find a solution that incorporates the motivations and aspirations and desires and experiences of so many throughout this place we call home, what we'll actually end up with is a much better designed policy that can be implemented in a way that genuinely works for people. And that is what Michelle and I are keen to set out to do. You know, in the last 5 weeks, we've been out and about trying to set that very, very positive tone. And I believe, look, that is incredibly important, in my view, in leadership. To set a tone, to say and send that message that we are going to step up, we're going to work constructively together. But much more than that, we just don't want to be symbols of the executive. We don't want to be two strong women working together, trying to find some agreement to pop out at the other side of an executive process. What we want is very much to be the leaders of the executive that actually deliver against some of these big, big challenges that we face. And we know that we cannot do that on our own. We know that the only way to get that change at every level across our public services, our economy, our society here is by working with people, just like all of you in this room today, the people who will use those services out on the ground. And that's what we are determined to do. Yes, not to elongate a process, not to have endless consultations and processes, but of course we want to listen to people, and that's what we are intending to do. We are determined that at the end of this 3-year initial period of leadership of the executive, that we can stand by proudly, not just of a record of constructive working, but on a record of delivery. And we genuinely look forward to not only working together to achieve that, but working, as I indicated, shoulder to shoulder, hand in hand with all of you in this room today and with all of those fantastic organisations that do such valuable work right throughout Northern Ireland, day by day and week by week. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you both very much. I have a bone actually to pick with both of you. You're not escaping just yet. No, that's just away. I got asked by the Assembly to come and help with some sort of explainer videos that they wanted to run should devolution be restored. And it was kind of in the back of my mind, I was kind of hoping that that wouldn't actually happen, that these videos would never see the light of day. But thanks to you, reaching agreement, they're there. But ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much to our First Minister, Deputy First Minister. You can see that they are busy. And they have got a busy schedule, so thank you to them both for taking time to speak to us this morning. And again, I suppose just another personal reflection, I was there as a political journalist covering the devolution when it was restored the last time in 2007, and I think we can recall that was such a unique and new experience, the potential optimism that was in the air. And there is maybe a sense of that again today, and yet in very different circumstances, maybe a more jaded environment beyond, but the sense of working together is interesting to see that happening, and no doubt many of you feel that the longer that lasts, the better. But there's a lot of work to be done, not just by political leaders, but by everybody that's in this room. So our next section really is to develop that conversation, look at accelerating action together. That's the headline. And we want to hear from a number of key stakeholders, get their thoughts, and then we want to develop that conversation at each of the tables, come up with ideas which we can then share with the room. So let's just sort of kick off with that, first of all. And I want to go to one of our stakeholders that we have in the room. It's Sir Robert Chote, who is leading the Fiscal Council here in Northern Ireland, and of course was previously running the Office for Budget Responsibility, which will be very much in the headlines later on today when it comes out with its figures. But first of all, Robert, I suppose just give us your thoughts, first of all, opening up on where you think things are at the moment for Northern Ireland, its kind of financial position, and what you think, are the issues that people here should be focusing on.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Jim. Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here. As you say, we're meeting today at a time at which we're going to hear from the Chancellor this afternoon about taxation and public spending plans at the UK level, and that provides a hugely important backdrop to the financial situation that Northern Ireland faces because of the huge importance of the block grant in determining what departments and arm's length bodies have to play with. And we'll obviously be interested to see on what choices are made around tax and spending later today. But clearly, looking back at the big picture, this is a constrained financial environment and has been for some time for public services across the UK, and so to some degree, that's Northern Ireland's position is part of that common story. As Neil had mentioned, and very sensibly didn't go into the detail of, the financial package that's been put in place to accompany the restoration of the executive is an important and valuable thing. And there are different ways of looking at this as a glass half empty, glass half full. I think the opportunity, the glass half full element of that is important to seize upon without diminishing the challenge and the ongoing debate there's going to be around that. So essentially there are two elements to this, one of which is upfront financial support, not as much as everybody would like to deal with the immediate pressures, particularly around pay, and a decent-sized chunk of money in the next 2 financial years, but by no means a walk in the park in terms of delivering public services over that period. There's also, importantly in the longer term, the agreement that in future, to use the jargon, Barnett consequentials, which basically means the increases in the block grant here that result when the UK government increases spending in England on things for which the executive is responsible here, is henceforth going to be topped up by 24% on top of what would previously have been seen. Now, there can be a big debate over 24, is that exactly the right number? But the fact that it's there means that you're not on this relentless downward, what's known as the Barnett squeeze on the resources, and that's something that's a positive for the longer term, but it doesn't have a huge impact in the near term. So if you look at this package, there's upfront support, there's a useful boost to sustainability in the longer term, and then the challenge in the sort of 2 to 3 years out, in particular, when the short-term support largely goes away and the longer-term boost has yet to fully come in. Now, I think as one comes to thinking about budgets and planning, and as Department of Finance obviously will have to address this, how much you basically work on the basis that, there's some additional money now, but it's going away. So for heaven's sake, don't think medium term. Don't think about transformation, revenue choices, savings across that longer period. That would be an opportunity to be missed. This package is not the end of the conversation. Obviously, there will be negotiation. There is, the executive is united on this, if on nothing else, that there's more that needs to come in that point. But if one is going to unlock extra money and resource that will help you through that middle period, then a convincing story on public service reform, on thinking about revenue, on innovation, on savings where there can be, is going to be an important part of that. So I think, again, taking all Aide's points about, we're in an uncertain world and God laughs in particular at those who look at year 2 or year 3, you nonetheless in workforce planning, reform planning need to have that perspective. So the fact that this package doesn't have you a perfect glide path over multiple years is not an excuse and shouldn't be an excuse for not having that important thinking, that engagement, that innovation, because it really is an opportunity that is there to be seized as well as a challenge that everybody's got to get through.
And on that point about reform then, what's the incentive to the people in this room, in their organisations, to come up with, a package of reform, say, where they are, which may save money? How do they kind of How should they be incentivised to sort of lead that reform?
Well, I think the ultimate incentive is seeing reform as a mechanism to be able to deliver better services, more responsive services to the people of Northern Ireland. And so there are particular incentives over the need to put in place a transformation plan and a mechanism for a board that will look at how that is working to unlock some elements of this funding package. But obviously the broader incentive is that this is going to matter for the people who, in communities who are recognising or are the ultimate beneficiaries of those. I think what it also, as you know, to the theme of the conference, the importance of thinking about that as far as possible in a systems way and not in a siloed way is absolutely key. The idea of getting to a position where there is collective agreement on a programme for government that is then linked clearly to the financial decisions. I mean, when I arrived in this role, the last point at which the executive was collapsing, the big plea from every stakeholder was, let's have a clear strategy at the level of the executive and make sure that the money is following the strategy and supporting reform and supporting those sorts of long-term decision making. So the need to translate, the visible sign of unity here across departments in these cross-cutting areas is more powerful now than ever.
Great stuff. Thank you, Robert. We'll pause with you there, but don't go to sleep just yet. We might need you later on as well. And maybe I could go to Pauline Poots. Pauline is here from EY Ireland, and I suppose it would be interesting, Pauline, to get your views from the private sector, maybe any lessons from other regions or where you think emerging best practices.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I just, first of all, before I come into that and thinking about the broader lessons learned that we've seen over the last number of years, I just wanted to say a particular thanks to Neil Gibson. I was really struck this morning, I think he may have left the room already, but I was really struck by his honesty this morning. We don't often hear, actually, in terms of Neil and leadership's perspective of actually how it impacts on them personally. And we don't often get an opportunity to think about how resilient they need to be, about the decisions that they need to take, which clearly sometimes are very unwelcome and sometimes publicly are actually seen to be very negative because the understanding perhaps isn't there. So I just wanted to spend a moment saying thank you. I think that's really important to think from that perspective. So I wanted to think for a few moments this morning just really about some of the reflections that we've had as a firm. And that's in terms of what we've seen over the last number of years of where the equivalents of Northern Ireland Civil Service, public sector entities have worked through the COVID period and actually of some of the lessons that they have learned coming out of that. I did have the opportunity to work very closely with Jane and the PermSec group in the last number of months around a lessons learned and a reflections exercise. And actually what that really told me, it provided me with a real insight through a consultation that we had both with public sector officers at all levels across the organisation, but also around recipients of COVID funding across multiple sectors. And actually, what it really, really made me stop and think about was about a commonality of purpose. So there was essentially emergency where actually everyone came together very naturally in an agile way because there was a common purpose there to ultimately keep our citizens in Northern Ireland safe, but equally to do our very best to protect the economy, that we were going to be able to step up and get working again when the time was right. So there was definitely there, despite the lack of IT infrastructure, this was pre-Teams, despite that capability, there was actually a really clear desire that we saw cross-departmental coming together in a way that I would say that I and certainly the service were reflecting on. They've never seen that level of energy before, and they've never really experienced that way of working before. And I think that's incredible. And actually that sentiment we have seen in lots of different similar pieces of work that we have done across the offices globally. So in terms of the sentiment, my question would be, in reflecting on this morning's conversations and presentations, how do we harness that? At the pre-conference dinner last night, we talked about how do we harness that and how do we take this forward to really embed and instill change that we all know that we need to make a real difference. There was a sentiment perhaps that actually that energy has already been lost because of the fatigue of financial constraints and the ongoing challenges. Well, I think if it has been lost, and let's hope it hasn't, we need to get that back, and we need to get that back very, very quickly. And it's a question around how do we do that? So we've heard this morning around collaboration. Certainly, there's no question we need to collaborate. Of course we do. And coming back to David's point, we're not going to do lots of co-buzzwords this morning, but it is about thinking, how do we do this in a different way? This conference is an annual conference. This provides a very unique opportunity, actually, for leaders across the central government sector, for ALBs, for local government, and our voluntary colleagues as well, to come together and actually, I would say, and reflect in a way that you don't often get a chance to pause and reflect. This is really important, but we need to do more of this. We left last year's conference with lots of tangible actions on how we were going to take forward change. And I think it's fair to say, Heather, and speaking to yourself and Anne and David and Nicole, some of that, because of the busyness, has been lost to an extent. So I would encourage everybody today to think about, how do we harness the energy? How do we think about something tangible coming out of today? And how do we ensure going forward that we do get the time to get that collaboration and that conversation, which is so important, not only with our own departments and our own organisations, but to do as across departments, to bring in the talent that we see with our ALBs, to bring in the talent and the learnings from local government, which is very powerful, and the third sector. The private sector is here. We're listening and, speaking for private sector who has the privilege to work with government and support change. We're ready to help. And that will in itself also help to think about digital tech enablement, different ways to achieve outcomes that we absolutely need to achieve with the constraints of financials in the background. But I think having a very, very clear and very succinct number of prioritised areas that Jane has talked very clearly about, having an outcomes focus, but in terms of how do we actually deliver to make that change to our citizens, we must deliver and collaborate in a different way, harnessing what we've learned from COVID, but harnessing and actually doing it better. Let's use technology, let's use a different way of thinking and be bold, be ambitious, and there are no constraints here in terms of the how to get to those outcomes.
Good stuff. Thank you very much, Pauline. Thank you. Let me get some input from the voluntary sector. Celine McStravick is here from NICVA, and obviously a big sector, big part of whatever change is going to be delivered. So, Celine, what are your thoughts?
Well, I have a very privileged position being Chief Executive of NICVA, but also quite privileged having listened to the speakers this morning, because I'm going to be stealing lots of their comments and see if you can spot who said what. So I'm going to start with who is the we, when we talk about we need to work together. And I would argue that we have a huge untapped resource in the voluntary and community sector. We have over 50,000 people employed, over 200,000 volunteers, a real efficiency model in terms of value added. You give us £1, we'll multiply it. But actually what's most important is we are a civic society. So if we're talking about the non-dystopian era, maybe Taylor Swift will come out with that one next. We are actually core to making all that happen. I think what's most important as well is to think about resetting that term about being a courageous leader, and that means saying what needs to be said. So I've been in my position for just over a year, and I think we're really good at talking collaboration. We're really good at saying we respect each other, but actually when it comes to the bit, we just continue as is. So I think we need to call each other to account. We need to identify good practice and actually ask people why they are continuing to do what we would see now as not so good practice. We're very lucky to have had our First Minister and Deputy First Minister join us as well. And actually, when I listened to them, I thought, goodness, it feels like a bit of a golden opportunity here. We have two politicians agreeing, but they're talking about designing policy by speaking to the right people. So who chooses who's the right people? I obviously argue would be the people who are actually lived experience, the people who are going to be using the policies that we develop. So it's starting at the coalface. No surprise to tell you that that's the voluntary and community sector who are there every day. But also David started this morning by talking about our language, keeping it simple, speaking to people, listening to them, but then changing our behaviour as a result. So the bit at the end is probably that I struggle with. I think sometimes it can be seen to listen, but I would like to see a bit more change at the end. And of course, Neil Gibson, who absolutely was so impressive, standing up there without a note, talking from the heart. Where would you get it? To have that talent in Northern Ireland. But that talent stood up there this morning and said, do you know, I don't care who delivers what. I only care what are the problems we need to solve and how we best solve them. And I'm in that camp. I want to be on that bus, leaving that bus stop, because I can tell you that when you look at the voluntary and community sector, who said this, Aid, we can do what AI can't. We are the heart and the soul. We are the people at the front line. We are the ones coming with the lived experience and the actually, if you change this, here's a more efficient way of doing it. So I talk about our sector underpinning economic and social well-being across Northern Ireland. We completely disrespect silos. We put people at the centre, and we are underpinned by our own values. So courage is important, curiosity, compassion, and collaboration, but most importantly, change. We cannot keep on living hand to mouth. And I mean, no one in this room can do that. It doesn't matter what sector. But it would leave us with the final thought. When I hear about stabilisation, transformation in the public sector, I would argue that it doesn't matter what sector. I think we need transformation across Northern Ireland. We're missing a trick. Workforce planning in the voluntary and community sector as well. If you're looking for our economy minister to talk about journey to net zero, our sector are part of that. You can't ignore us. Digital transformation is the same. So if we aren't actually invested in, let's remove that word funded, if we're not invested in, then you won't see the change at that grassroots level.
The whole ethos of today about keeping that conversation going back and forth between everyone that's here today in the room. So let me just introduce who we have with us today. We have Ruth Sutherland. Ruth is chair of the Patient Client Council. We have Richard Baker from local government. Richard is now the chief executive of Antrim and Newtownabbey Borough Council. He's been there for 100 days in that post and has experience at Causeway, Coast and Glens before that. Beside Richard, we have Colin Coffey. Colin is chair of Public Health Agency and AFBI and incoming chair of PSCF. So he is a busy man and has got plenty of connections with what we're discussing here today. And finally, glad that Claire Archibald has joined us. Claire is Director of Ending Violence Against Women and Girls at the Executive Office. So a great lineup for you. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to invite each speaker in turn to just come up and say a few short remarks, and then we'll get into the conversation. So if I could ask them when I introduce them to come up, and you can speak from the podium or you can speak from the chair if we grab a microphone, but preferably just come up to the podium, and once you've delivered your remarks, come back to your chair, and then we'll begin the discussion after that. So to begin, if I could ask Ruth Sutherland, Ruth, to speak to us. Thank you.
Squeakskill here. Thank you so much. I'm kind of flattered at being called a new leader in this system when it feels like I've been around for ages. But I'll do my best to try and stimulate and galvanise some of our thinking today. So I moved and made Northern Ireland my home 35 years ago, working in health and in the community and voluntary sector. The last 15 years, though, took me weekly commuting to England. I'm back now, re-engaging and puzzling about what's changed, what hasn't, and what needs to. Overall, despite all the best efforts of everyone, I, like others, can't really see any systematic change. I'm reminded that our very first programme of government was for a healthier people, and yet here we are. Incredibly, many people still do get good service, but for example, the lived experience of people that the PCC works with is testament to the extent of system and individual failure at human level. It just feels to me that we haven't done enough, differently enough. We are simply testing the current model to destruction. Yes, we are in extremely challenging times, but this is precisely the time when we need different the most. It's clear that we know that we can't keep doing the same, but we seem to struggle about, well, how do we do different? I'm going to suggest two areas where I think sustainable system change could come from. First, I think we need to do so much more to engage and release the biggest asset that we have, and that is the public themselves. A unified vision for Northern Ireland co-produced with the public is the starting point. At the Patient and Client Council, we are testing a new model of public engagement and advocacy which embraces the patient and the client as a key asset in their health and social care. It replaces a transactional model with a collaborative and relational one. We aim to demonstrate the value of public participation in delivering system change, continuous service improvement, and policy development in pursuit of better health outcomes. We're working to find out what works for whom in terms of public engagement. We are beginning to see positive outcomes. In 2020, 80% of the complaints that we supported people with ended up in the formal complaints process. In our substantially larger 2023 caseload, it's now just 45%, achieved through mediated early resolution. This takes huge cost out of the system, but importantly increases satisfaction levels of all parties. The altruism of the public is truly tremendous. The starting point for most complaints is that people want other people to have better experience. But to me, the real game changer is when it comes from redefining the nature of the relationship between the public and their service to one of genuine partnership, adult to adult rather than parent to child. The culture of public service has just not kept pace with the rising expectation and opportunities that people have. We could seize this as an asset rather than working defensively against it, trying to manage expectations. Political discourse, which of course the public sector gets caught in the maelstrom of, is always about the size of the state, not about the nature of the relationship between state and citizen. Achieving this paradigm shift involves conceding power, because that's what this is all about, changing the power relation and the interactions between the public and their services. This idea is not new. There's been lots of brilliant examples that we've seen even today. I've been talking about it for 40 years at least. So we have to ask, what stops us? What stops us leading this change, leading system change? All our initiatives are always on top of, instead of. Sharing power can be painful, and of course we know this in Northern Ireland like nowhere else, but we also know that we have to if we're going to prosper. Everyone says, everyone knows that Northern Ireland is so well placed to lead the way, to be that case study. So what stops us? We could make Northern Ireland the case study, delivering a cultural step change in our public services if we decided to. But it's not just about the nature and quality of service, which brings me to my second point. The biggest benefits of all is when we can engage the public in delivering better, more cost-effective outcomes, led and delivered by themselves. This is how we engage with lived experience and stimulate innovation. I've time just for one short example, but one of my other roles I'm chair of a social enterprise in Salford, in Manchester, called Social Adventures. It's employee-owned and led, with profits all ploughed into the community. Local people own and benefit. It delivers services previously delivered by statutory services, but differently, with better outcomes at better value. Examples like social prescribing, which we do have here, but it's embryonic. And I find it hard to understand why hasn't had more traction. Some of the why, I think, is about being risk-averse. It's about the fear of blame, getting things wrong. It's this over-centralised system that we have, a fear of letting go, the fear of empowerment, and what that really means. But one of our newest initiatives in Salford has been rethinking residential children's care. This is a huge cost for the 10 Greater Manchester local authorities, just about 90 million a year. Costs are rising at an alarming rate, and so is demand. It costs £4,000 a week per child for residential care. It costs £1,000 a week for foster care, but foster care is in steep decline. Most residential placements are out of area and siblings are unlikely to be placed together, which disrupts lives further. The Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, called together the public sector, local authorities, community and voluntary sector, and said, we could do better for the children of Manchester. Go away and come back and tell me in 3 months how we can do better. There was a hive of activity across highly developed, large collaborative systems, and it has resulted in a network of small residential units across Greater Manchester run by different community and voluntary sector organisations. Social Adventures will open one 4-bedded unit in July, alongside 10 others. In a very short piece of time, we have made change. This is not a project, it's the result of a system change. So I've got others, but I've run out of time. When we think differently, we can do differently. What's stopping us? Let's just get on and do it now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruth. That's very interesting, really some really interesting case study there. It's interesting food for thought. Next up, we've got Richard Baker. Richard's Chief Executive of Antrim and Newtownabbey Borough Council. Richard.
Good afternoon, everyone. Like Ruth, I'm not a local. I first arrived here in 1990 wearing a green uniform in South Armagh, met a lovely lady and I stayed. And it's been quite a journey since then. And often I reflect back and where I am now, where we are now, and it is quite an incredible journey that we've all been on. But reflecting back on the last 100 days, so I started in mid-November in Antrim, Newtownabbey Borough Council as the Chief Executive. Fortunately, I've written everything in blue ink, so I can't read a word on the page. So I promised the councillors what I do for the first 100 days is listen, learn and understand the organisation. So what have I been doing? So fundamentally, I've been building relationships within the organisation, building the relationship with the councillors, with the staff, with those external partners, MLAs, MPs, and all those various other agencies, particularly the permanent secretaries and also civil servants within the Department for Communities. I've also fundamentally been working on communications within the organisation, ensuring that those communication channels are strong, through the corporate leadership team, through the heads of service, through those staff, through the council meetings, making sure that good governance is applied throughout the whole organisation. But fundamentally, what I've also been doing to reinforce those relationships within the organisation is trying to be as authentic as visible within the organisation and trying to apply the 50-50 rule. Being out there, walking around, meeting the staff, asking questions and asking them to ask me questions as well. Because fundamentally what I'm trying to achieve within Antrim and Newtownabbey and maintain, following the previous Chief Executive, is a service-orientated organisation. I've heard the inappropriate phrase, which is sometimes applied to public sector organisations, the self-licking lollipop. My experience of Antrim and Newtownabbey, it certainly isn't. It's a people-centric organisation. It invests in its people, really inspired by the Healthy Places discussion earlier on, which is very much focused on that healthy wellbeing environment. My leadership approach is very collaborative, very inclusive, trying to create almost a leader as coach philosophy within the organisation, supporting within a blame-free organisation. We've heard about being risk-aware instead of risk-averse, and it's very, very difficult in Northern Ireland and through my own experiences to walk that fine line. But despite my own approaches about the officers within the organisation, I fundamentally believe it's about political leadership. And I'm really fortunate and privileged to be in an organisation which has collaborative, respectful political leadership within the organisation. And Antrim and Newtownabbey benefits from the main political parties working together, looking at the big picture. And it's evident in everything they do, whether it's the growth deal or whether it's community work within the organisation. So really what I emphasise here is that political leadership is absolutely fundamental to what I do within the organisation and cascading that positivity through the organisation. So where do we go from here? Where does my next 100 days lead and beyond that? We hear the phrase silo working, we hear the phrase about collaboration. But what I see, not just in Antrim and Newtownabbey, but having worked in other local government organisations, is the fragmented approach of what we do collectively here in Northern Ireland. So whether it is tackling deprivation, economic inactivity, and the increasing levels of poverty, we have to look at what we do in terms of those projects and programmes. So whether it is the PCSP, Police Support and Community Partnership, David, no acronyms or jargon, I just nearly got caught out there. Whether it is good relations, whether it's community development, whether it's the labour market partnership. We have so many positive programmes which inevitably duplicate each other in some way, shape or form. And I believe there is an opportunity to join up, not just along local government, but central government as well. And it's the same at an investment level as well, whether it's regeneration, whether it's infrastructure, communications, at a low level with community and leisure facilities. So whether it is tackling the deprivation, the source and the cause of what we're dealing with at the front line of public services, but also in terms of those programs, those projects as I've alluded to, but also in terms of investment. You know, for the last 8 years, working under the leadership of David Jackson in Causeway Coast of Glens, applying for funding from Levelling Up, the Growth Deal, Shared Prosperity, Shared Island, complementary funds. It's all piecemeal in terms of our approach and how we approach funding and how we approach investment. When we focus on specific projects, it really works. And I had the privilege to work with John McGrillen, David Jackson, on the Open Golf Championship in 2019. And when we came together with a common purpose, a common focus, there is no doubt that we exceeded the expectations of not just the R&A, Royal and Ancient, at the Open Golf, but the attendance, the spectators, and obviously the level of investment that was required. Another example is integrated care and community planning. There is no doubt there is duplication there as well that we need to consider and move forward. So after 100 days in the role as a Chief Executive of Antrim and Newtownabbey, I'm still here. It's very positive. I feel very privileged to be in such a positive organisation with real, true political leadership. Thank you very much indeed.
Richard, thank you very much for that. We'll dig into some of that when we get into our questions, the whole idea of leadership and its importance. Next, could I invite Colin Coffey to address us. Colin is Chair of the Public Health Agency, among other roles. Colin, thank you.
Squeak's getting worse, or it's just maybe my weight. Look, good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted as incoming Chair of the Public Sector Chairs Forum to see you all here today, and hope you've all had a very wonderful day. Before I get into the meat of what I want to talk about, I'd just like to pay tribute to the current chair, at least until the end of the month, Nicole. I think Nicole has done a wonderful job in her role over the last couple of years, and it's been a delight to work with her, and hopefully she will continue to be involved. But it's been really, really interesting, and I've learned a lot from her. So what I want to chat about for the next few minutes or so is really, I suppose, what is the role of the public sector chair and public sector boards, and how we as those non-execs assist, support and challenge some of the topics that were talked about today. And I suppose we have to start with our fiduciary duties. You know, why are we there? What is our role as chairs? What is our role there as NEDs? And it's very much around this fiduciary duties, it's governance, it's making sure we have a balanced budget, and it's making sure that activities within the organisation are really aligned with the strategic outcomes that are for that organisation. But I certainly see it as a lot more whenever you start talking about strategy and you talk about strategic intent. And I think the first thing you've got to recognise is the skill set that is there within these ALB boards or department boards through the NEDs. There's a vast array of skills that I see the chairs wanting to link into, make sure they're used, and make sure they're there to assist the organisation. And I think that is something all departments should embrace. I've been fortunate working with permanent secretaries who definitely do see that, and have been I can see the benefit of that coming through. But I suppose the big role for me as chair is that role of strategic engagement. You know, trying to understand where the organisation sits in the wider public sector and in the wider community and voluntary sector, and how that as chair we can pull all those organisations together to try and have a bigger impact on the people of Northern Ireland, the citizens of Northern Ireland. I'm a great believer that one of the challenges we have going forward, and we've heard it throughout in a lot of discussions today, but I put it more simply, how do we get 2 + 2 to equal 5? We've got to get a bigger return for what we do. We all have agreed, I've heard it once, partnerships, collaboration. How do we do that? I do see that as a role of the chairs, to assist that, to try and influence that, to try and encourage that. Because I think that most of the people in this room are extremely busy. And I think, I've heard it over coffee where I've said, well, we did talk a lot about this last year, but nothing happened because we all just get immersed in our day job. And I started as Public Health Agency Chair in November, very similar to the role of going out, meeting and greeting. And I mean, I'm quite happy to share this, but I've met with all the trust chairs and I've said to each and every one of them is, let's you and I agree our own outcomes. What are we going to, if you like, sign up to as individuals? What are we going to try and do that's going to make things better? Because that's the important thing in here, is taking personal responsibility and accountability for trying to change things. And certainly that is my intent. I'm also a great believer that if you bring more people into that partnership, that collaborative network, you will achieve more. I personally don't care if AFBI or PHA are the lead in any of these, as long as we get our outcomes addressed and we actually start to have an impact on society. So I reach out, I talk to a lot of people, I see that as my role. My chief executives don't have the time to do that, but that's what I try to do, and I try and encourage my NEDs and the 2 boards that I am very proud to be chair of to do. I also think one of the big issues for us is we don't focus enough on outcomes, we don't focus enough on impacts, we tend to focus on outputs. And I really do think we need to have an agreed outcomes, and we had some very good discussions earlier. We all talk again about collaboration and partnership, but to achieve what? How do we get people to sign up for it? I thought the example in Manchester, I think it was very good, bringing together all interested parties. We have a problem, how do we solve it? If I take us back 3-4 years ago to COVID, we have a problem, how do we solve it? We all come together, we solve it, we get on with it. Why has that gone away? Why have we lost that ability to actually solve problems? And I get back to, this is where I see the chair's role. The chair knows the strategic intent of the organisation. The chair needs to know the strategic intent of the department. And, you know, the partnership agreements, the initiative that has been there for quite a number of years now, I think is a very, very important initiative. But a partnership agreement is words on a piece of paper. The partnership working and how we do things is more critical to us all. I'm very pleased to say that AFBI was the first organisation to sign a partnership agreement. That was, Stuart, 3 years ago, I think it was. If I had to look and say, well, where are we now in our partnership working with the department? 60% of the way there. So it's not easy. But where it is working, My DAERA colleagues are here, if I might say. Where it is working, I think it's working very effectively. And we are seeing programme working, we're seeing more long-term development. That's very easy with AFBI because it's research programmes. They don't start and finish in a year, they're long-term. But we understand totally the direction of travel that we're going in. And I again see the chair's role as ensuring that there's a clear understanding of the shared outcomes that are coming from the department and into the delivery body. And it's that working together, I think, it will be a lot more effective. So if you can imagine the model, you've got the policy makers, you've got the delivery body. That delivery body is reaching out to the community and voluntary sector to see where is the best interaction, to how to deliver that outcome the most effective in the sector that they operate in. And I think in both organisations, PHA and within AFBI, and for my sins, I'm also on the board of Invest NI, you can't do everything yourself. And we talk about collaboration, we talk about partnership, we love talking about it. I was here 2 years ago, we talked about collaboration and partnership. So, I would just urge everybody to make commitments, personal commitments with people that they work with. What is the outcomes we're going to have that's going to make it better? But moving on from that, I think the chair does have the opportunities to go out there and talk to people. They've got to make time because that is for the best interest of the organisation that they're in. And if we can do more of that together, and hopefully next year we can go back and say, yeah, we do have a number of collaborative networks going on. We do have a number of partnerships going on where we're actually starting to see the benefit. But that will only happen if we can agree the outcomes that we actually want to achieve. Now, if you use obesity as an example, we're talking to FSA. How do we deliver that? But FSA and PHA will not do that on their own. It is inevitable we will be wanting to reach out to other bodies, but the outcome is to reduce obesity. And if we reduce obesity, especially in children, then hopefully we'll see off the big problem we have with type 2 diabetes, and we will help the hospitals, to help the trusts. So this is all joined up thinking to me, but the role of the chair is to try and see that bigger picture, to try and see it coming together, to try and influence, because we're not executives, so we are influencing, we're challenging, we're looking at the bigger picture, but at the same time we're trying to ensure good governance. So hopefully that chimes with a few of you. That's what I try to do as chair. My chief executives, who are both in the audience, can tell you whether I do it effectively or not, but that's to me the approach that public health chairs should have. So thank you very much.
Colin, thanks for that. Now, last of our speakers, before we get into some questions and answers, Claire Archibald. Claire is Director of Ending Violence Against Women and Girls in the Executive Office. Claire, thank you.
I'll say that squeak is most disconcerting. It's great to have a chance to speak to you today, and I must say, today, for me, has been all about conversations with people who have been saying, we need to be involved in your work, you need to be involved in our work. And I'm the director of the Ending Violence Against Women and Girls programme in the Executive Office. So it's a small task, obviously, and it's a job that I was given during the pandemic, when you will know that a lot of us watched an awful lot of television. And as I was trying to think, how do I approach this? I had this picture in my mind of joining the dots, and actually our theme today, there's a dotty table down in the middle there, which is our joining the dots table. But I was going, where did I get that image from? And it was just recently I realised it's one of the title sequence in Gogglebox. So when you're next watching Gogglebox, if you do, there's a shot which comes up of the UK at night, and as the camera pans over it, you can see all of the lights lit up and all of the little lines of light joining up all the different settlements. And that, to me, is a picture of what my team needs to be doing, because we can't deliver ending violence against women and girls on our own. We're a small team, and right across all of your organisations, there are people who are involved in prevention work with young people, in educating young people for safe and healthy relationships, in in lighting our streets, in policing, in justice, in local government, in any organisation that you can think of. There is something that you can do which will contribute to our goal. So how do we join up? I think that what I'm going to tell you now is going to allow me to write my book, retire, and go on the conference circuit. Are you ready for it? We need to talk to each other. We need to follow up the conversations, and then we need to do stuff. And the stuff doesn't need to be big. It can be really small. But the point about a big change is it's made up of a lot of little changes. In the executive office, another place where we have seen that is in our place-based work. You know about urban villages, TBUC, the Together Building United Community, and the Communities in Transition work. And Gareth Johnson, who directs those programmes, is here today. Anyone who works in places and works with communities knows the patchwork of funding and the patchwork of actions that everyone is trying to take to do their best. There's a test and learn pilot going on across the civil service where we asked ourselves what would happen if all of the agencies working in a particular location worked together. We need all the interventions, we know we do, but they need to be layered and they need to be delivered in a way where groups are not trying to seek different funding for different things, measure projects against different evaluative criteria, using different systems with different reporting cycles, which come to, with funding that comes to an end at different times. There has to be a way to do it better. Now, I'm really looking forward to what Test and Learn is going to tell us, but we can already see some places in Northern Ireland where that's happening. If you think about Derry, Londonderry, a place where they have a disproportionate amount of good stuff going on up in the northwest. And one of the things I'd like to mention is Foyle Family Justice Centre. Now, Foyle Family Justice Centre came from a very simple idea. What would happen if all of the agencies that you need to talk to if you're leaving a violent relationship were in the one place? So they did that. So police, housing executive, education to get your children moved to a new school, social security, debt advice, all of those things are in one building where you can come to and where they come to you in sequence, rather than Women's Aid in the Northwest did a study of how many, to look at a citizen journey from the point where you realise you have to leave a violent relationship to the point, where you're sorted out and you've started your life again. 37 different agencies was the average number that people had spoken to. There has to be a way to do it better. It is a bit like, and some of you have heard me use this analogy before, who is old enough to remember Morecambe and Wise? Almost everybody. I tried this at Queen's University recently, blank looks all around the room. All I'm going to have to say to you is all of the right notes, but not necessarily in the right order. It's the Eric Morecambe problem. And looking at all of the organisations in the room today, why are we all playing a plinky-planky little piano tune, which is our bit of the solution, when we've got an orchestra? There's an opportunity in the Shared Leadership Forum to look at the leadership, the governance, and the practical steps that we need to take to join up our system better. Not having money and knowing that we have to stabilise can make our colleagues, can make us feel a bit bunny in the headlights. But that's the very time when we have a burning platform, we have the opportunity to engage differently, to do differently. Ministers spoke this morning about their desire to work together, to be positive, to have ambition. And we know that those of you who are in the voluntary and community sector, those of you who are in ALBs, you want to work in partnership. You don't want central government to be a kind of parent-child relationship. Those are the things that I wanted to reflect back to you from today. And just to end with a question. We talk about, yes, we need leadership. Yes, we need collaboration. Yes, we need all of these things. Collaboration is a bit like, there's another ageing reference about to come up here. The U2 concert from before they were famous in the Macefield Leisure Centre. Yes, you see, if everybody who says they were at that concert was there, frankly, they would have filled Croke Park twice over. Like that. Let's not just actually say we were there. Let's do it. Think of one meaningful thing that you can do to collaborate with another organisation after today, so that we don't come back next year and go, look at that. Yeah, we all got kind of hyped up last year and then we didn't do anything. But it was lovely. Let's actually do something. It doesn't really matter what it is. Well, it does, obviously. But the point is, when you take one small step, you move. When we all take one small step, we go on a journey together. And that's the thought that I would like to take away from today. Thank you very much.
Claire, thank you very much indeed. I think there's some sort of common themes coming through there from each of our speakers, I suppose relating back to kind of personal responsibility and what each of us can do. So let's get some questions from the floor. Anybody want to jump in? I want to maybe just, there's a question over here. Yes, David, we'll come to you. Just while the microphone's going across, Ruth, could I ask you, just in terms of the example you gave about what you've done with the social enterprise in Manchester and residential care for young people, one of the arguments quite often is that the rules here aren't right, or the system's different, or the structures are wrong. But to some extent, you're just kind of saying, well, we just got on and did something. So if you were to think about that in relation to what your work here, are there structural barriers, or do you think sometimes those are overblown, that people can get on and do things?
I think maybe there are structural barriers. I mean, Manchester has a devolved health and social care budget, which is actually about the same as the budget here, but it has twice the population that we have here. But there is definite, that clearly with the mayor and the devolution, there is that real opportunity for leadership, which should be possible here. So I don't know, I think it's something to do with permission. And all waiting, we're all waiting to be told to do something rather than just doing it. But I think some of the themes of today, like we talked about the over-centralised, for such a small place, with such a small population, the fact that we think we have to hang on to every penny and work it out rather than giving. So I think that our community and voluntary sector is really well placed to play a bigger role, but I think they're waiting to be asked. Waiting for permission.
Great. We'll come back to our speakers again in a moment. First question, I think, was just here at the front.
Thanks, Jim. Just a question for Claire. Just and picking up on Ruth's story about Greater Manchester. Just your point about the 37 agencies that are maybe touch the lives of a single person. And funny, I was talking to the T-Buck team earlier, and we were talking just about how we can actually improve, the lives of people in the most disadvantaged areas. And my question is, what would happen if the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister called in the permanent secretaries, the sort of chief executives of all the involved agencies, the chief executives of relevant local councils, and said, like Andy Burnham, I'm going to give you all 3 months, and in those 3 months, I want you to identify the programs that really make impact, the programs which have less impact, and come back with a plan which will show how we can coordinate everybody better and focus on doing the things which have most impact in terms of improving the quality of people's lives. What would happen if that conversation took place?
I take it that mass panic is the wrong answer. No, I mean, it's a really interesting question because, first of all, we need to know which programmes are making the impact. The other thing that we need to do is to be prepared to say, actually, that thing over there is not working. It's mine, it's my responsibility, and it's not working. And to know that that's just part of life and not something that is going to reflect badly on you and you will forever be known as the guy whose thing didn't work. I think the question is what we reward in the system. And the expectation which goes right up to ministers that actually when we do it better when we do it together. Because if the department, if your minister and your department need a programme which is their thing, that is going to kill collaboration stone dead. But when ministers are working together, whenever you've got a cross-executive desire to work better together, I think that you can drive it from the top. And I love the Manchester example.
I think it's worth trying.
Thanks.
Good idea to take away.
Another question there.
Hi, Emma Gillis from Gartner Consulting. We worked very closely with Dr. Eddie O'Neill to deliver the COVID cert, and we did that at high speed. And it was, a great example of how to get something in very quickly. But what we were able to do was sidestep some of the governance that's in place. But that caught up with us about 6 months later, when people were asking us why we were doing a retrospective business case. How do we change the governance in Northern Ireland? How do we speed it up? How do we make it more agile? Because we've had so many conversations here. There's so many people that want to do things, but one of the things that's stopping it is the governance. And I don't know how you change that here, but I'd be really interested to find out.
Okay. Maybe, Colin, and I'll ask Richard to come in on this one as well, just a quick one on that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point, very good question. And I think that's why I mentioned it has to be shared outcomes. If the department want to do something with the delivery body or delivery bodies, then it will happen. So it's got to be an understanding of shared outcomes, and that's got to come whenever the programme or the outcome is being debated. So the challenge is, when does the policymakers bring in, if you want to call it the experts within the delivery bodies, to design that programme? And then I think it would go through very quickly, because everybody's thinking would be aligned. But it comes back to outcomes, not outputs. And that's why I keep emphasising that. What does success look like? What are we trying to achieve? And certainly the world I'm in, I see too many outputs, not outcomes, which are great, fine, but whenever we're in the challenge we're in with money, it comes back to the point knowing what programme do you not do, because my guess is a lot of the stuff we do is the old 80-20 rule. 20%, 80% of the impact will come back from 20% of the activities. But we need to know that. And I'm not going to single out any organisation, but we're not good at it. That's the big challenge. But shared outcomes for me would work wonders. And I think certainly with the departments we're working with, that is where we're going. That it can be better, but it can be better from the ALB as well as from the department. But it is a journey. But I think it's a journey well worth we should all go on.
Thanks. Richard?
I might be fairly controversial in what I'm about to say, but I do believe the necessary level of governance should be applied. And I suspect that everyone in this room has seen business cases developed without the clear demand analysis or evidence of need clearly illustrated. Procurement, which has been not necessarily applied appropriately. And then fundamentally, from my perspective, it's all based upon 21 votes out of my 40 councillors, i.e. majority decision. So I'm not necessarily seeing in local government, and I was in Causeway Coast and Glens for 8 years prior to where I am now, I'm not necessarily seeing a burden in governance. I just think it needs to be applied appropriately through a proper evidence of need business case approach in terms of what programs are working, what programs are not working, proper scoped procurement, and then the right decision-making process with the right information provided to our politicians, whether it's council or central government, for them to make informed decisions with the right information. So I think it's about going through the process, clearly identifying and understanding the process to get the right outcomes. But from my perspective, what I'm fundamentally endeavouring to do day in, day out, is to ensure that my members have the relevant information to allow them to make an informed decision without bypassing governance.
Thanks, Richard. I think, Ruth, you just wanted to come in there?
I just wanted to add, I don't think that empowerment and good governance are not mutually exclusive. And I think what we need a more empowered system. I mean, PCC is £2 million, tiny, it's tiny, but we are monitored and scrutinised in the same way as a trust. We have to fulfil all of the requirements in terms of everything that we're trying to do, that a trust has to do, and yet the size of a trust. So it's about proportionate. I think good governance should be an enabler of empowerment, and it's empowerment that we want, I think.
Thanks. Another question here?
Hello, my name is Mark Larry. I'm here with a housing executive hat on, but I also have a role with the recently started with the non-exec with the business services organisation. And as somebody who's just had a lifetime in the private sector, I come to the table and I have a suggestion, just elephant in the room. Could we expand the role of what the business services organisation does across the broader public sector? And the first answer is you have to change the legislation to do that. That to me is going to take leadership from the top that is going to say, right, let's legislate to do that. One of the advantages of what I'm suggesting is that there are actually a lot of vacancies, particularly in the ICT side of the thing, because there's duplication of effort that don't need to exist. Now, I would hope that there would be buy-in to trying to change that legislation rather than it being a barrier. It's not specifically a question for you four, and you all spoke very well, but I would just like, is this something that you've heard that, oh, well, you need to legislate or we need to change that? Because if that's what we need to do, I'm sure the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister who spoke brilliantly today would surely dictate that from the top that we do that. So why can we not do that?
Thanks. Colin, any thoughts on that, just from your experience in the different organisations and then where you've seen blockages?
I haven't come across that, but I do think that it shouldn't be a barrier. I think the ALBs, if there is the right case in point to make something happen, the ALB should put forward the business case to make that happen. And I certainly have been involved in some things where the organisation does want to change its function, and it's been welcomed by the perm sex. So it's coming up, and coming back to the points already been made. You know, why are we doing it? What is the outcome? Properly researched, properly documented, and making sure that we understand why we're doing something. And that's something I don't think happens enough, if I may say so.
Thanks very much. Unfortunately, time is against us, but ladies and gentlemen, a big thank you to all of our panellists. Thanks to Ruth, Richard, Colin, and to Claire. Thank you. So, as we come to the end of the full conference proceedings, let's one last segment for us just before we head off. And our next section is entitled Transformation Lessons for Northern Ireland. And our speaker is a Senior Director at Gartner. And Robert has worked across many different levels within the organisation, focusing on state and local government. His coverage areas include digital transformation across local government and ICT procurement in the UK. Yeah, we've just got one last section before we wrap up, and I'll sort of thank everybody at the end, and there will be one other just little segment of that if you have extra tickets for it, which is the launch of Epic Futures Northern Ireland. But as I say, before that, just to bring matters to a close for today and leave us with some engaging thoughts, if I could invite Robert Stoneman from Gartner to speak to us. Thank you, Robert.
Brilliant. Well, I know I've got the unenviable position of keeping people from refreshments, so I'll try and get going pretty quickly. But I think we can all agree that this conference couldn't be more perfectly timed. A renewed power sharing agreement means there's also a renewed emphasis on the opportunities to think creatively about how we deliver public services. And I think the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland put it quite well when he said that Northern Ireland, yes, it faces massive challenges, but ultimately you have the tools ultimately to grasp them. And he's right, there are massive challenges, and many of them are truly global in nature, from technological factors such as the rise in generative AI, to the shifting political order and the upcoming cycle of elections we've got in many areas, to global inflationary pressures, increasing demands on services, potentially because of an ageing population, for instance, and changing social norms around how we live, how we work since the pandemic. There's also the question of how we maintain trust in government, the regulatory challenges, for instance, on how to responsibly pilot and scale AI. And that's not to mention the growing climate crisis. Just wait for this to catch up. These challenges leave governments and agencies with quite a stark choice, in my opinion. Do we simply continue to scale existing digital initiatives further and further, in the hope that more online services or more digital transformation will help us address these challenges? Or do we start to think a bit beyond this, at what comes next, beyond the point where just scaling existing initiatives offers ever-diminishing returns? Well, this is why we've developed the concept of post-digital government. And to get an idea of what it means in practice, it's worth thinking back a bit, 20 years or so, to the birth of what was initially termed as e-government. Now, back then we saw attempts at putting existing services online, and while that made access easier for citizens, these services remained largely process-driven, reactive, and essentially siloed. More recent digital transformation efforts over the past decade have shifted that focus somewhat, with new ways to design and deliver on citizen expectations, such as identifying key life events, citizen journeys, delivering more services via mobile applications, one-stop shops, that kind of thing. All of it ultimately underpinned by a more proactive use of data. And for most governments, current services tend to fall somewhere into these two buckets, these two areas. And indeed, going into the pandemic, when we measured the digital maturity of many different public sector organisations around the world, we found that 80% were still largely in that e-government phase. Now, there's been progress since then for sure. And still though, for the most digitally mature, digital has effectively normalised. As a result, the business case for simply scaling efforts further and further is starting to diminish. So this is where the concept of post-digital government comes in. It asks that we reframe the conversation somewhat to identify and prioritise investments that deliver on the core mission-critical outcomes of your organisations, so that digital transformation is not just seen as an end in itself, effectively. So ultimately, digital transformation should be a foundation. And thinking of the analogy of a house, it's important, yes, but you can't live on a foundation alone. You need to build a functional house that has all of the various parts and components necessary. So we think there are three key parts to a post-digital approach to government. Firstly, embracing a truly empathetic understanding of citizens and staff, building off of the human-centred approaches that many of you are already exploring, and which, secondly, is built on improved data insights, balancing between anticipation and reaction. And finally, coordinating and incentivising a wide ecosystem of different partners, since digital technologies ultimately are more impactful, most impactful when they generate change outside of your own organisation. And doing this is vital, because government leaders that are not able to change the conversation risk their agendas effectively not receiving sufficient attention when competing for resources, and especially when those resources are as constrained as they are now. And we've seen that with today's budget, that situation, that constrained picture will continue on into the future. Therefore, post-digital government, and thinking about it in this way, is a way of emphasising the role of digital data and technology teams as a value centre within the organisation and not just a cost centre. Now, I'm sure many of you are still wondering, what does this actually mean in practice? Well, while no governments at the moment are truly post-digital in their entirety, at least not yet, many are starting to explore this area. So really, why should you also be starting to think about this, especially since many of the services within your own organisations will be at differing levels of maturity? So, as a case in point, let's start right here in Northern Ireland. What I believe is an early example of a post-digital approach starting to develop. So we think back to the pandemic and the work of the Department of Health and the successful rollout of the COVID NI app, which includes a fully functional digital identity solution, despite all of the challenges that COVID-19 presented at the time. Now, this was built on SureCert's digital identity solution, a company that's based right here in Northern Ireland, right here in Belfast, and whose work alongside various partners, including the department, led to almost 1 million people successfully verifying their identity digitally since November 2021. And it's this great work that's led to SureCert just last April being appointed as the digital identity partner for the government of Thailand. So the innovative work of the GovTech community and private enterprise here in Northern Ireland with an empathetic focus on what works for citizens, combining the best of public and private leadership and innovation, is already being held up as an example across the globe. But what about elsewhere in the world? What are some of the examples of some of the exciting work that others are doing in this area? Well, I want to start by looking at a couple of case studies that demonstrate this concept of empathy. So in Ukraine, an empathetic understanding of the urgent needs of citizens, which understandably are some of the most challenging in Europe, has led to DIA, which is a single open source app that delivers services such as uploading tax returns, renewing passports, or even something as simple as claiming a free bus pass, all through a single mobile app. Now, this was developed initially before the war in around 2020, but it really came into its own after the Russian invasion, especially as the scope of services that were offered through it and that could be accessed via it increased significantly. Now, Poland has also started to develop their own version of this. So, as a result, Ukraine and Poland are the first European countries where a digital ID on a smartphone is legally equivalent to an ID that's in your pocket. And they're not alone as well. Estonia has also started piloting its own application based off DIA as well. So, the key point here is, despite the invasion and despite the intense pressures that the Ukrainian government was under, they were still able to continue working on it, continue innovating with it, and meet the changing needs of citizens at arguably the most trying of times for the Ukrainian government in recent history. And if that's not a true example of an empathetic approach, then I don't know what is. Moving across the Atlantic towards Washington, D.C.'s Child and Family Services Agency. Now, they're really also embracing this concept of empathy, but in a slightly different way. Now, the challenge that they are facing will be familiar to anyone who's worked in children's social care in this country. Just being involved in these sorts of cases can be extremely distressing for all parties involved. It also includes working with some of the most vulnerable in our communities, and in many cases dealing with care workers who are overworked and in all honesty, quite burnt out at the moment. So what did they do? Well, they used a form of machine learning, specifically called sentiment analysis, to help their care workers be more empathetic in how they interact with families. Now, this was initially used in training sessions to analyse in real time whether care workers were getting stressed out or potentially using words that might cause additional anxiety to the people that they're dealing with. Subsequently to this, natural language processing was also used to then generate transcripts, which could be used to measure the success of the project. Now, the outcomes from this have been quite substantial, with a demonstrable reduction in stress levels among care workers in DC across 54 different metrics. And I think most telling about the success is the fact that when they started the program, only 5 individuals wanted to be involved. Well, a year later, that had risen to 97% of the care workforce in DC, who were using it in their own time to hone their skills and to better help the families that they serve. So our advice is that government organisations need to prioritise empathy in all aspects of service design, taking a human-centric approach which designs services with, not just for, users. Failure to do this risks us falling back into a mindset that prioritises our needs in how we deliver services currently, which is easy to do in challenging times, understandably, over the actual societal outcomes and that we're ultimately looking to improve. And that could be, for example, not just assuming that digital channels are always the best ones, especially when dealing with sections of society that are digitally excluded, and sometimes that can be through choice. But these pillars of post-digital, they're not silos, they work in concert together. A more empathetic approach is built on and also informs greater use of data. And while the use of data in government is widespread and nothing new, a post-digital approach recognises that more data cannot support operational decisions if the insights that are delivered are not timely, and that a more predictive approach does not always necessarily generate better outcomes, especially if the data that underpins it is insufficient. And for a great example of managing this balance in practice, let's focus on India, where 2 regional governments are using data insights to improve road safety. Now, the problem here is quite substantial. Half of all road accidents in India occur on national highways, and that's despite the fact that this constitutes just 5% of the total road network. On top of this, the process to identify accident hotspots can take up to 3 years, and sadly is still largely based on statistical analysis of areas with the highest levels of fatalities. So, with this in mind, Project Irasti was born, and this is a unique partnership of industry, academia and government, which is being driven by the governments in Telangana and Nagpur, and it involves several steps and several different technologies. Firstly, buses that ply on national highways have been fitted with collision avoidance systems. Now, these monitor the vehicle's speed, they have a camera so they can scan the road, and they can warn of potential collisions, things like lane departure, speed limit violations through onboard telemetrics. These alerts are then given back to drivers via a mounted display and a speaker, which helps to extend their reaction times by up to 3 seconds. Now, on its own, this is already a great outcome, but Irasti goes a lot further than that. And what it does is they take all of the data and all of the alerts that have been generated and map them using a GIS, and then also analyse them using machine learning, which is used to identify potentially dangerous locations that, once they have been identified, are earmarked for re-engineering. And this is the crucial point. Authorities no longer need to wait for fatalities to occur before they can identify the black spots and then do something about it. So we can already see the balance here between reactive interventions, such as the driver assistance technology just mentioned, which has led to a 30% reduction in front-on impacts and a 67% reduction in lane departure warnings, and the predictive, proactive approach that has shortened the time it takes to identify a black spot to as little as 3 months, down from 3 years. Now, taking a slightly different approach, in Canada, a study came out a few years ago that showed there was an increase in hate crimes across the province of Alberta. So, with this in mind, authorities in the capital of Edmonton realised that to make a change, they would need more data and to be able to do more with it. So, the internal IT team created an app as part of a wider project called Lighthouse, which could be used to identify hate symbols that were out in the community. So this was initially installed onto the phones of 160 members of staff, so that when they were out and about, they could take photos of anything that they thought was suspicious. This was then run against a database of known hate symbols that had been provided by partners in the project at the Anti-Defamation League. And a form of AI called computer vision was then used to analyse this and to match it. So what's important here is that they were not just looking to identify the hate symbols just to get them removed, but also to identify how to target educational resources aimed at combating extremism in various communities, and ultimately to try and get to the root cause, not just treat the symptoms. Now, this is a great example of using data that came at not a lot of extra cost to the city, and yet still had a big impact. And so as a result of this, they're looking to expand this out, not just throughout the city more generally, with more staff, more people will be able to use the app, but also across the entire region. So governments need to go beyond just being data-centric, and investments in data and analytics need to be able to generate actionable insights. This involves using insights to strike the right balance between the predictive capabilities to identify and consider likely scenarios, anticipate likely outcomes, like the mapping of potential accident hotspots that was just mentioned, and on the other hand, identifying actionable critical moments, such as the warnings for bus drivers out on the highways of India that require some kind of immediate intervention. Now, greater empathy and improved data insights will deliver really only limited benefits unless organisations can more actively work together with digitally connected, incentivised and empowered partners, coordinating all of them around the mission critical priorities that are crucial to your organisations. So if we're thinking about ecosystems, one type of ecosystem that we at Gartner have started to explore is the emerging concept of a super app. Now, put simply, a super app is effectively a mobile application that provides end users, be they citizens, partners, employees, with a set of core features such as payments and messaging, which are then augmented by a range of additional mini apps, all of which can be used and removed as the user sees fit. So it's a bit like a Swiss Army knife of apps, effectively. And while this is very much an emerging technology, the one place in Europe that is starting to explore the use of this is Istanbul. And they have developed the Senin app, which provides an all-in-one experience that transforms how the city engages with its citizens and helps increases the city's economic value for everyone, all of the partners involved. And this ecosystem contains a range of different capabilities, including a digital wallet, payment, identity, translation, a marketplace, communication. But crucially, they support more than 60 different mini apps. So this supports services in areas like citizen engagement, utilities, transport, a pharmacy, news, traffic, parking mini app, ones for arts and culture, weather, and areas like jobs. And this is all built using a specific platform called Cobalt Shift. And what it allows the city to do is to extend Senin out to a range of different partners, including those in the private sector, who can offer their own mini apps on the platform as well. So in essence, it's a great example of both public and private sectors working together to serve the citizens better in a more joined up fashion. So moving back to the UK, what about when governments want to reduce crime? Well, to achieve that end goal, we are seeing attempts to leverage a similar partnership approach being led by the Ministry of Justice. And they're thinking about how do we better integrate prison leavers into communities once they've been released and to help prevent reoffending. So crucially, the MOJ realised that to really achieve this sort of mission critical priority of theirs, a diverse ecosystem of partners with different experiences and different perspectives needed to be brought together. Specifically, they created 4 different teams, or what they termed service communities, each with a focus on a different area that was one of the key challenges facing prison leavers. So that was around employability and skills, health and well-being, community and relationships, and quite a crucial one, what ultimately happens on the day of release from prison. As part of this, the MOJ invited technology companies and other small business partners to help design and develop a range of solutions that can help mitigate reoffending. And one of these is called the Turning Pages digital app, which is aimed at prison leavers with low literacy levels and is there to ultimately address the challenge that over half of people in prison struggle with reading, and many, in fact, can't read at all. So it enables them to help improve their reading skills after release and is based on the successful work that many will be involved with in prison under the peer-to-peer Turning Pages initiative, which is already very successful and has been rolled out across many prisons. So instead of taking just the historic approach, focusing on having a better understanding on the statistics around reoffending, the MOJ is looking to a range of public and private sector partners and thinking about key questions like, can an app help improve literacy rates? Can digital tools, other digital tools, improve integration of prisoners once they are in the local community? And ultimately, can all of this lead to less reoffending? So in many ways, it's an example that demonstrates all 3 aspects of post-digital government in action, mutually supporting one another to help the MOJ achieve its mission-critical priority, which is to reduce crime. So as digital approaches start to normalise, governments need to look more broadly and creatively at who they partner with and engage and coordinate these partners using a combination of different techniques to fund, incentivise, motivate and ultimately to reward those participants. Now, I appreciate these are just a few examples. We've got several others as well, so feel free to reach out to myself or to Gartner more generally, and we'd be more than happy to take you through a few different ones. There's some examples from right across the road, others including the FCA example there from the UK. So, in summary, what are our recommendations on the next best steps? How might you want to start thinking about this in part of your approaches to, and why is it's something you should start thinking about doing right now? Well, when thinking about the needs of citizens and staff, it's a bit like your own personal health and well-being. So, as an example, running is a great way to be fitter, healthier, and just generally feel good. But if, in pursuit of greater health and well-being, I was to start running, say, a 5K, a 10K, and then aim for a marathon, I know I'd become exhausted pretty quickly. I'm definitely not the most accomplished runner. But I don't need to be able to run a marathon to be able to reap the benefits of running. And I'd see diminishing returns if I focused all of my free time and efforts on doing just that alone. Instead, it would make much more sense to make running just one part of the bigger picture. And that might include doing a range of different activities. Digital transformation is, in principle, effectively the same. You don't need to move up from 5K to 10K to full to half marathon to start thinking about the wider benefits and the ultimate outcomes that you're actually looking to achieve in society. And for those interested, this comes from our post-digital maturity model, which is designed to help organisations understand where they sit on this scale, the e-government scale, the area of digital transformation, then increasingly moving into this post-digital government approach. So in summary, leaders in the digital data and technology professions should be mindful of post-digital objectives, regardless of the current levels of digital maturity in your organisations, and start pushing up and driving the use of technology into the policies that are defining how your organisations deliver your mission-critical priorities. Secondly, you should start to create a truly empathetic approach to service delivery, prioritising empathy in all aspects of service delight and taking a human-centred approach which designs services with, not just for, all users, whether they're citizens, staff or partners. Thirdly, you should go beyond just being data-centric and make sure that the insights that are generated from data are truly actionable and strike that right balance between being reactive and predictive to deliver ultimately the optimal outcome. And finally, you should manage and cultivate an ecosystem of partnerships to pull together a range of relevant stakeholders across public, private, the voluntary sectors around the desired outcomes for your organisation. So it's just a little bit of research from our end there. If anyone's interested in reading up more, feel free to speak to me or to any of my colleagues. Thank you for inviting me here, and pleasure to speak.
Thanks very much, Robert. So, a lot to take away there with us as we wrap up proceedings today. So it's been a very interesting day from my own point of view. I've really enjoyed being here today, seeing the absolute energy there is in the room and the determination to make a difference and really start doing some of the things that you've been talking about. I think, there are a lot of challenges in Northern Ireland, but there are also, I think the sense I've got from what people have been saying in the discussions is that it's just not to focus on necessarily the blockages, but to get on with things where possible and make things happen. So I think there's a lot to be done. It'll be really interesting to see how things develop over the next 12 months. A big thank you to the sponsors who helped enable today, to everybody that took exhibition space, but also in particular to EY and CGI for helping support today's event. So thanks very much to them. Apparently, I'm told that there is a special link to CGI which will be sent out in the email, which will have some more details. So look out for that as well. A special thank you, I think, and maybe perhaps you could put your hands together for Heather and for Anne for all their work and for their team for pulling this together. I've no doubt the Chief Executives Forum, the Northern Ireland Public Sector Chairs Forum and SoLACE will be ensuring that what comes out of today will be built upon in the months ahead. There will be a recording available and an evaluation will be sent out in the email also, so keep an eye out for that. Now, if you have a ticket for the launch of Epic Futures Innovation Policy Project on economic activity, you can join colleagues in a moment in the Ballygowan foyer. But for now, though, that's the end of this year's conference. Thanks for your attendance. Thanks for your participation. Hope to see you all again soon. All the best. Thank you.